My wife handed me divorce papers right in the middle of my engineering department. My boss stood behind her, flashing a triumphant smile, treating my humiliation as his personal entertainment. Neither of them knew I had just inherited $560 million, including a controlling stake in the very company he ran. I signed the papers without a word. 60 days later, I walked into the boardroom as the new chairman, and the blood drained completely from their faces. Before I tell you how I dismantled their perfect betrayal, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogant people always get what they deserve in the end. My name is Jameson. I am 70 years old, an African-American man who spent 40 years building a legacy from the ground up only to watch the people I loved try to tear it down. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the heavy glass doors of the research and development floor swung open. Yvonne marched down the central aisle. Her high heels clicked against the polished concrete, a sharp, rhythmic sound that made 24 engineers stop typing and look up. She wore a tailored crimson dress I had paid for last month. Behind her trailed Nolan. He was 55, wearing a custom Italian suit, carrying the entitled arrogance of a CEO who inherited his position rather than earning it. Nolan stopped at the threshold of my cubicle, leaning against the glass frame with his arms crossed and a smug smile pasted across his face. Yvonne did not say hello. She stopped in front of my cluttered drafting desk, reached into her leather handbag, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She slammed them down right over my blueprints. The loud smack echoed across the open plan office. Every conversation ceased. The hum of the ventilation system suddenly felt deafening. I looked down at the bold black letters on the front page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I looked up at my wife of 40 years. Her eyes, which used to hold warmth when we struggled to pay rent in our 20s, were now completely devoid of affection. They were calculating, cold, and entirely focused on my destruction. I had spent 4 decades at this company. I designed the very schematics that kept this building structurally sound. I gave my youth, my energy, and my loyalty to providing Yvonne with a life of comfort. Now she was standing in the center of my professional sanctuary, turning my life's work into a public spectacle. The silence in the room grew suffocating. The younger engineers stared at their monitors, too terrified to intervene. Nolan simply watched, his smirk widening, waiting for me to break. Yvonne did not lower her voice. She wanted an audience. She announced to the entire floor that she was taking the house in the suburbs, the 2 cars, and every penny of the retirement savings I had built over 40 years of grueling engineering work. She leaned over my desk, her voice dripping with venom. You are a washed-up mechanic, Jameson. You are an old man who peaked 20 years ago, and you are holding me back from the life I actually deserve. I sat perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my honor. I knew arguing with a woman who had already decided to destroy me was a waste of breath. Nolan took a step forward, invading my workspace. His presence was a calculated threat. Listen to me carefully, Jameson, Nolan said, making sure his voice carried to the neighboring cubicles. If you create a scene on company time, or if you cause any distress to Yvonne, I will terminate you on the spot. You will lose your pension, your health care, and your dignity. Sign the papers and save yourself the embarrassment. I looked at Nolan. This was a man who had never held a wrench, who had never stayed awake for 3 days straight to fix a critical system failure. He was a corporate parasite who stepped into the CEO role 5 years ago and immediately began claiming credit for my department's innovations. He thought he held all the power. He thought I was just a tired, defeated old man clinging to a job. He was severely mistaken. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my heavy silver pen. I did not read the demands. I did not contest the loss of my house or my savings. I flipped to the final page, pressed the pen to the paper, and signed my name with a steady, fluid motion. I pushed the documents back toward Yvonne. I handed her everything she demanded without shedding a single tear. Yvonne snatched the papers. She looked slightly disappointed. She had come here expecting a fight. She wanted me to beg, to plead for our history, to show weakness in front of the man she was currently sleeping with. I denied her that satisfaction. I simply stared back at her with absolute emotional detachment. The man she thought she was destroying no longer existed. Yvonne let out a short, mocking laugh. You always were a coward, Jameson, she sneered. Not even a fight left in you. Enjoy your empty life. She turned on her heel and walked away. Nolan stepped away from the door frame, falling into step right beside her. Before they reached the exit, Nolan placed his hand on the small of her back. It was an intimate, possessive gesture performed deliberately in front of my face and my entire team. They walked out of the department arm in arm, leaving a trail of shattered dignity in their wake. As soon as the heavy doors swung shut, the quiet whispers erupted across the floor. My coworkers cast sympathetic glances my way. Some looked incredibly angry on my behalf. A junior engineer took a step toward my desk to offer condolences, but I raised my hand to stop him. I did not need their pity. I pulled a small cardboard box from beneath my desk. I placed my ceramic coffee mug inside. Next, I took down the small framed photograph of my late uncle from the corkboard. That was all I needed. I left the blueprints, the achievement plaques, and the 40 years of corporate memorabilia right where they were. I picked up the box, stood up straight, and walked down the central aisle. I ignored the stares and the whispered apologies. I kept my eyes fixed on the elevator banks at the end of the hall. I pressed the button and waited. I felt no sadness about leaving this cubicle. I felt no grief over the sudden brutal end of my marriage. The betrayal stung certainly, but the clarity it provided was a profound relief. I stepped into the elevator cabin. I did not look back at the engineering floor I had built. The polished steel doors slid shut, cutting me off from the whispers and the pitying stares. The elevator began its rapid descent to the ground floor. In the quiet solitude of the cabin, my phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out. A secure text message from my attorney, Hayes, illuminated the screen. The words were short, precise, and infinitely powerful. The asset transfer is complete. You now hold the $560 million offshore trust. You legally own 65% of this building. I read the message twice. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. Yvonne thought she was leaving me destitute. Nolan thought he was discarding a useless employee. They had no idea that they had just handed me the exact legal separation I needed. They had voluntarily severed all ties to me precisely 12 hours after I became a half-billionaire. The elevator chimed as it reached the lobby. I stepped out, no longer an employee, no longer a victim, but the absolute master of their financial fate. The clock had just started ticking. The leather chair in the conference room felt completely different from the cheap mesh seat at my engineering desk. I sat across from Hayes. He pushed a biometric scanner across the mahogany table. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing glass. The machine chimed, verifying my identity. Hayes looked at the monitor, his face completely neutral, and turned the screen toward me. The numbers were staggering, $560 million. The offshore trust had officially cleared probate. My late Uncle Silas, a man I had not spoken to in 30 years since I gave him my last $500 to start a logistics business in Chicago, had left me his entire empire. He had silently bought a controlling 65% stake in my company over the last decade, watching my career from the shadows. Hayes handed me a thick fountain pen. I tapped it against the table. I told Hayes to draft the termination papers for Nolan immediately. I wanted the man escorted out of the building by security before lunch. Next, I told him to draw up an eviction notice for Yvonne. She had demanded our suburban home in the divorce, a house I had paid off completely with my own salary. I wanted her out by midnight. I wanted them both to realize that the man they had just publicly humiliated now owned the very ground they walked on. Hayes did not reach for his legal pad to take notes. Instead, he folded his hands and looked at me with a sharp, calculating expression. He told me that acting out of immediate anger would be a terrible miscalculation. I was an engineer. I understood structural integrity. Hayes told me that the structure I wanted to demolish was already rotting from the inside, and I needed to look at the blueprints before I swung the hammer. Hayes reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red folder. He slid it across the smooth wood of the conference table. He told me his firm had conducted a preliminary forensic audit of the company the moment my uncle's trust initiated the transfer. I opened the folder. The first page displayed a complex web of wire transfers originating from the company's primary expansion account. I flipped to the next page. I recognized Nolan's digital signature authorizing every single transaction. Nolan had been siphoning corporate capital through a series of shell companies registered in Delaware. He was bleeding the research and development budget dry, the exact budget he claimed was failing, when he denied my team our annual bonuses last quarter. I traced the flow of the stolen money down the page. The funds pooled into a single holding company. That company had just purchased a $5 million luxury penthouse in the financial district. I looked at the final document in the stack. It was the deed to the penthouse. The primary resident listed on the document was Yvonne. She was not just leaving me for a younger, arrogant boss. She had actively conspired with him to fund her lavish new life using the very company I had dedicated my entire adult life to building. They were using my stolen bonuses, my delayed promotions, and my team's hard-earned revenue to finance their betrayal. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. Any residual pain from the divorce evaporated completely. This was no longer a domestic dispute. It was a calculated corporate heist. I closed the red folder and aligned it perfectly with the edge of the table. I asked Hayes what would happen if I walked into the boardroom today and fired Nolan with this evidence. Hayes leaned forward, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He explained that terminating Nolan today would trigger the executive severance clause in his current contract. Nolan would walk away with a golden parachute worth $20 million. The embezzlement evidence was strong, but currently it was entirely circumstantial without a full federal investigation. If I fired him now, Nolan would lawyer up, tie the company in endless litigation, and likely settle out of court while keeping his severance pay. Yvonne would sit in her $5 million penthouse completely untouched by the fallout. That was an unacceptable outcome. My engineering background taught me to never intervene when a faulty machine was in the middle of tearing itself apart. You let the gears grind. You let the friction build until the engine reaches a catastrophic, undeniable failure. Only then do you bring in the heavy machinery to sweep away the wreckage. I told Hayes to hold the termination papers. I instructed him to maintain absolute secrecy regarding the trust transfer. Nolan and Yvonne needed to believe they had won. They needed to feel completely invincible. Arrogance always breeds carelessness. I wanted Nolan to keep transferring those funds. I wanted him to cross the threshold from corporate misconduct into federal wire fraud. I wanted the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission to build the cage for him. I stood up from the mahogany table, leaving the red folder in Hayes' capable hands. I told him to monitor every cent leaving the company. When Nolan dug the hole deep enough to guarantee a 20-year federal prison sentence, we would bury him in it. I left the law firm and stepped out onto the bustling city sidewalk. The cold air felt bracing. I needed a moment to process the fact that I was now one of the wealthiest men in the state. I walked into a small corner cafe to buy a black coffee. I ordered, pulled out my wallet, and handed the barista my debit card. The young man swiped it once, frowned, and swiped it again. He looked at me with a polite but apologetic expression, stating the card had been declined. I told him to try it one more time. The machine beeped, flashing a red error code indicating the account was frozen. I pulled out my phone and checked my banking app. Yvonne had not waited a single hour after leaving my office. She had illegally frozen our joint checking and savings account, siphoning the entire balance into a private account under her name. She had deliberately left me with exactly $0, expecting me to sleep on the street tonight. I smiled, thanked the barista, and walked out of the cafe without the coffee. The game had officially begun. The city bus ride to the suburbs gave me exactly 45 minutes to process my new reality. The rain had begun to fall, slicking the windows and blurring the streetlights. I stepped off the bus 2 blocks from the house I had spent 30 years paying off. The porch light was on, casting a warm, deceptive glow over the manicured lawn. I walked up the driveway, reached into my pocket, and slid my brass key into the front door lock. It refused to turn. Yvonne had acted with astonishing speed. She had changed the deadbolts while I was still standing in the engineering department signing the divorce papers. I pulled the key out and walked around to the side of the house. Yvonne always forgot about the secondary garage keypad. I had wired the circuit board myself 15 years ago when Tamara kept losing her house keys after school. I punched in the 4-digit code. The heavy garage door rattled upward. I stepped inside, shaking the rain from my coat, and opened the interior kitchen door. The sound of clinking crystal and loud laughter immediately hit me. I stood in the hallway and looked into the living room. Yvonne was sitting on the custom leather sofa holding a flute of expensive champagne. Sitting across from her were my 35-year-old daughter Tamara and her husband Wyatt. They were toasting. My own daughter was clinking glasses to celebrate the destruction of my life. The scene crystallized instantly. This was not a sudden marital breakdown. This was a coordinated family mutiny. I stepped out of the shadows and walked into the living room. The laughter died immediately. Yvonne lowered her glass, her eyes narrowing into slits. Tamara stiffened, placing her champagne on the glass coffee table. I ignored them completely and walked toward the wooden staircase leading to the master bedroom. I only needed a few changes of clothes. Before my foot could touch the bottom step, Tamara moved to block my path. She crossed her arms, standing tall with a hardened expression that mirrored her mother's. "You cannot go up there, Dad." Tamara said, her voice devoid of any familial warmth. "This is my mother's house now. She needs to secure her assets." I looked at the child I had put through an elite university, the woman whose first car I had bought with my overtime pay. I asked her to step aside. Tamara did not budge. She held out her hand, palm up. "Mom says you have the mahogany display box with the vintage watches in your office upstairs. Bring it down and leave it on the kitchen island. She needs the liquidation money to cover the legal fees for the divorce. You owe her that much." The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air. Those watches were not luxury purchases. They were inherited from my grandfather, the only tangible history of my family line. Before I could process Tamara's sheer entitlement, Wyatt stepped forward. He stood next to my daughter, puffing out his chest, wearing a designer sweater I knew he could not afford. "Look, Jameson, just hand over the watches and leave quietly," Wyatt commanded, using my first name with deliberate disrespect. "We do not need your financial deadweight dragging us down anymore. Things are finally looking up for this family. My startup just secured a massive angel investment this afternoon, a top-tier venture injection. We are scaling our servers by next week." I looked at my white son-in-law, a man who had never held a steady job, who had leached off my daughter's income for 5 years while playing at being a tech entrepreneur. I asked him who the generous investor was. Wyatt smiled a smug, arrogant grin. "Nolan," he announced proudly. "He saw the vision you were always too old and blind to understand." The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Nolan was not just funding Yvonne's penthouse, he was buying my daughter's loyalty by financing her husband's hollow company. The depth of the betrayal was absolute. My wife had sold me out for a younger man in a penthouse. My boss had stolen my company's money to finance his illicit affair. Now my own daughter and son-in-law had eagerly joined the conspiracy, trading their loyalty to me for a stolen corporate handout. They stood there, a united front, waiting for me to scream, to break down, or to fight for the vintage watches that held my family's legacy. I did none of those things. I simply turned around, walked into the adjoining home office, and retrieved the heavy mahogany box from the bottom drawer. I walked back into the living room and placed the box gently onto the marble kitchen island. Tamara looked at the box, then back at me, her face flashing a brief moment of confusion at my total compliance. I bypassed her, walked up the stairs, and entered the master bedroom. I grabbed a faded canvas duffel bag from the closet. I packed 2 old suits, a few dress shirts, and a pair of sturdy leather shoes. I did not take a single item of value. I did not touch the safe, the electronics, or the artwork. I zipped the bag closed, slung it over my shoulder, and walked back down the stairs. The 3 of them watched me in utter silence. I did not say goodbye. I walked out the front door, stepping back into the freezing rain, leaving behind the house I had built and the family that had sold my blood for a few pieces of silver. I walked 3 blocks through the downpour before a passing yellow cab finally pulled over. I climbed into the back seat, the damp fabric of my coat clinging to my shoulders. I wiped the rain from my face and pulled out my smartphone. The glowing screen cut through the darkness of the cab. I opened my encrypted messaging application and selected a direct line to Hayes. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard with absolute precision. My family thought they had stripped me of my past, but they had merely handed me the exact weapon to destroy their future. I typed my directive to the lawyer. Locate the primary software vendor currently supplying the cloud infrastructure and server hosting for Wyatt's startup application. Initiate a hostile buyout of that vendor immediately. Pay double the market valuation if you have to. I want total, unquestionable legal control of his entire technological infrastructure by midnight tonight. I hit send. I leaned my head back against the cold leather seat as the cab sped toward the city. Wyatt wanted to play the ruthless tech entrepreneur. Tomorrow he would discover who really owned the digital ground he stood on. The cab dropped me off on the industrial edge of the city, miles away from the manicured lawns of my former life. The neon sign above the motel office flickered, buzzing with a hollow electrical hum. I paid the clerk $40 in damp cash and walked down the exterior corridor to room number 12. The room smelled of stale smoke. It smelled of cheap bleach. It smelled of perfect manufactured desperation. I needed the illusion of poverty. I needed my enemies to believe they had completely destroyed me, because an arrogant enemy is a careless enemy. I threw my canvas duffel bag onto the sagging mattress. The springs groaned under the minimal weight. My phone rang, breaking the heavy silence of the room. The caller ID displayed Yvonne's name. I answered and pressed the phone to my ear. Yvonne did not say hello. She immediately demanded that I pay the court filing fees for the divorce. Her voice was sharp, dripping with the absolute certainty of her victory. She reminded me that since she was graciously allowing me to keep my clothes, I owed her the courtesy of covering the administrative costs of her departure. She laughed a high, piercing sound and told me to borrow the money if my bank account was suddenly empty. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my pride. I simply lowered my tone, letting my voice crack with carefully rehearsed defeat. I told her I would find the money. I told her she would get everything she wanted. I hung up the phone and smiled in the dark room. She wanted me broken. She wanted me crawling. She wanted me completely powerless. I would give her the performance of a lifetime. An hour later, a heavy knock rattled the cheap wooden door. I unlatched the chain. Hayes stood in the threshold, flanking two sharp-eyed men in pristine dark suits. They were top-tier forensic accountants, men who dissected corporate fraud with surgical precision. They stepped into the cramped, dimly lit space, their expensive leather shoes contrasting sharply against the stained, peeling linoleum. They did not comment on the squalor. They went straight to work. They unfolded a rusted metal table in the center of the room. They turned that flimsy table into a command center. They turned that flimsy table into an execution block. They turned that flimsy table into the exact point where Nolan's empire would begin to collapse. Laptops illuminated the dim walls with streams of financial data, offshore routing numbers, and hidden corporate ledgers. The lead accountant, a man named Sterling, pulled up the internal communications of my former company. He pointed to a flurry of recent executive emails authorized directly by Nolan. Nolan was panicking. The embezzlement used to fund Yvonne's $5 million penthouse had left a massive bleeding hole in the company's quarterly balance sheet. To hide the missing capital, Nolan was forcefully driving a rapid corporate merger with a rival firm. By merging the two corporate entities, Nolan intended to bury his stolen funds under a mountain of chaotic transitional accounting. The merger would effectively erase the paper trail, burying his theft beneath billions of dollars of restructured corporate debt. He was moving with desperate, reckless speed. He scheduled the shareholder ratification vote for exactly 14 days from today. Every digital footprint on Sterling's screen proved Nolan's absolute desperation. He was accelerating the timeline, bypassing standard due diligence, and bullying the board of directors into submission. He thought he was outrunning his crimes. He did not realize he was sprinting directly into the concrete wall I was currently building. I leaned over the rusted table, tracing the highlighted transactions on the glowing monitor. I told the accountants to dig deeper into the financing of this merger. I needed to know exactly how a CEO with frozen personal credit planned to float the operational costs of a multi-billion-dollar corporate transition. He was playing a dangerous game with corporate governance. I demanded to see the collateral listed for the merger's massive bridge loans. Sterling's fingers flew across his keyboard, executing a deep dive into the company's bridge loan applications. The data populated in harsh red text across the screen. Sterling shook his head in absolute disbelief. He turned the monitor toward me, pointing to the collateral listed on the newly drafted bank documents. Nolan was not using company assets to secure the short-term capital required to push the merger forward. He was using my assets. He was using the exact assets Yvonne had extorted from me hours ago. The documentation showed Nolan listing the entire equity of my paid-off suburban house and the full liquidated cash value of my surrendered 401k retirement account. He was leveraging the 40 years of my blood, my sweat, and my engineering patents to secure a massive commercial loan under Yvonne's name. He had completely manipulated her into assuming the total legal risk for his corporate cover-up. Yvonne thought she had stripped me of my wealth to live like a queen. Yvonne thought she had secured her absolute financial independence. Yvonne thought she had permanently won. Instead, she had blindly signed over every stolen penny to a man who was actively using her as a human shield against federal fraud charges. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. Nolan was stealing my past to fund his escape, leaving my former wife holding the bag when the authorities inevitably came knocking. I told Hayes to let the loan application proceed without any interference. I wanted Nolan to bind himself legally to those stolen assets. I wanted the chain around his neck forged with his own blinding arrogance. If Yvonne wanted to trade my devotion for his deception, she would bear the full weight of his financial ruin. I watched the red numbers blink on the screen, a digital testament to their impending doom. The second accountant suddenly stopped typing. He pushed his chair back from the table, his face draining of all color. He flagged an immediate catastrophic threat to our meticulously planned timeline. He pulled up the company's internal audit logs on his secondary screen. The company's chief financial officer, a fiercely honest veteran executive I had worked with for a decade, had just tripped a manual security protocol. The CFO had finally found the bleeding hole in the research and development budget. The digital logs showed the CFO quietly copying the exact ledger entries that exposed Nolan's offshore transfers. The accountant looked up at me with urgent, absolute certainty. The CFO was silently preparing a comprehensive whistleblower report. If the CFO walked into a federal building tomorrow morning and alerted the authorities, the FBI would raid the corporate headquarters immediately. Nolan would be arrested prematurely. Nolan would be arrested before the shareholder merger vote. Nolan would be arrested before my trap fully closed, completely ruining the devastating public execution I had engineered. I had to silence the chief financial officer before sunrise, or my entire silent adjustment would burn to the ground. The concrete walls of the corporate parking garage amplified the sound of every approaching footstep. I stood perfectly still behind the massive structural pillar of level sub-3, letting the dense darkness conceal my figure. My breath plumed in the freezing subterranean air, but my heart beat with slow, methodical precision. I did not have to wait long. The sharp, rhythmic echo of expensive leather dress shoes hitting the pavement signaled his arrival. The chief financial officer walked toward his luxury German sedan, his shoulders tense and his eyes fixed straight ahead. He carried a heavy leather briefcase that undoubtedly contained the very audit logs my forensic team had detected just an hour ago. He pressed the unlock button on his key fob. The sedan chirped loudly, its bright halogen headlights briefly illuminating the damp concrete and the oil-stained parking lines. I stepped out from the shadows and positioned myself directly between him and the driver's side door. The man jumped back, dropping his car keys onto the floor in sheer panic. He quickly recovered, his sudden surprise morphing into deep, venomous indignation as he recognized my face in the dim light. He ordered me to get out of his way immediately. He called me a disgruntled mechanic who did not know when to accept defeat. He reached into his tailored cashmere coat pocket and pulled out his smartphone, loudly threatening to call building security to have me arrested for trespassing and harassment. I did not move a single inch. I did not raise my hands to pacify his manufactured outrage. I simply watched his hands tremble as he unlocked his digital screen. I told him he could call security if he truly wished, but the authorities arriving would be federal agents and they would be seizing his briefcase first. He froze completely. His thumb hovered over the dial pad. He demanded to know what I was talking about, treating me like an insane old man making empty, desperate threats in a dark parking garage. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn overcoat and withdrew a heavy military-grade encrypted hard drive. I tossed it effortlessly onto the pristine hood of his sedan. The metal casing hit the luxury vehicle with a dull, heavy thud that made the executive flinch. I told him that drive contained absolute flawless forensic proof of Nolan's offshore embezzlement network. I told him it cataloged every single dollar stolen from the research and development budget to purchase a $5 million penthouse in the financial district for my former wife. The chief financial officer stared at the hard drive, his arrogant posture crumbling instantly into genuine terror. He asked me how a fired engineer managed to breach the highly encrypted corporate ledger. I buttoned my coat against the biting chill of the garage. I informed him that I was no longer an engineer. I explained that exactly 12 hours ago, an offshore trust transferred $560 million directly into my legal possession. I looked him dead in the eyes and stated clearly that I now owned 65% of the company's voting shares. I owned the concrete pillar he was hiding behind. I owned the towering glass skyscraper above us. I owned his employment contract. The man stopped breathing. He looked from my stoic face to the hard drive on his hood, his analytical mind desperately calculating the catastrophic magnitude of the shift in power. I stepped closer, closing the physical distance between us to assert total dominance. I told him I knew he was preparing to march into a federal building this morning to file a whistleblower report. I told him his moral compass was commendable but exceptionally poorly timed. If he blew the whistle today, Nolan would walk away with a severed contract and a golden parachute while the federal authorities locked up the company assets in litigation for years. That was completely unacceptable to me. I reached into my other pocket and produced a sealed legal document drafted by Hayes just an hour prior. I slapped the thick envelope against his chest. I offered him an airtight, legally binding corporate immunity contract. If he kept his mouth shut and let Nolan proceed with the fraudulent merger, I would legally protect him from all federal prosecution. Furthermore, upon my official ascension to chairman of the board, his current salary would be tripled, retroactively applied to the start of the fiscal year. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to choose between a lucrative partnership or becoming collateral damage in my silent adjustment. The chief financial officer looked at the thick envelope in his trembling hands. He carefully broke the wax seal and pulled out the crisp legal document. The ambient light from the overhead fluorescent fixtures illuminated the distinct signature of my high-powered corporate attorney at the bottom of the page. He read the terms with the speed and precision of a man whose entire existence revolved around rapid risk assessment. He saw the ironclad immunity clauses shielding him from Nolan's impending fallout. He saw the staggering compensation figures guaranteed by my newly acquired trust. He swallowed hard, realizing that the man he had just threatened to have arrested was offering him the financial exit strategy of a lifetime. He lowered the document and met my unwavering gaze. The previous hostility was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, respectful submission. He reached into his breast pocket, retrieved a silver fountain pen, and signed the contract directly against the cold roof of his car. He handed the document back to me without a single word of protest or hesitation. I folded the contract meticulously and placed it securely in my coat pocket. The alliance was officially forged. The executive then opened his heavy leather briefcase. He bypassed his audit reports and pulled out a bound black itinerary. He handed it to me with a nod of compliance. He explained that this was Nolan's unfiltered, highly classified private schedule for the next 2 weeks. It detailed every backdoor meeting, every illicit financial bridge loan negotiation, and every luxury dinner the CEO had planned to celebrate his stolen victory with my former wife. I now held the exact tactical map of Nolan's impending self-destruction. I had the corporate gatekeeper fully secured in my pocket. The trap was successfully protected from premature detonation, leaving my enemies completely blind to their own demise. Before I could turn to leave the damp garage, the chief financial officer stepped forward with genuine, unfeigned urgency in his eyes. He warned me that Nolan's fraudulent merger was not merely a paper transaction designed to bury his embezzlement. The CEO had secretly negotiated a ruthless blood clause into the transition agreement to satisfy the acquiring firm. Nolan planned to mass terminate 500 senior factory workers the very morning after the merger was ratified. He was going to strip them of their hard-earned pensions and health care to artificially inflate the stock price for his own maximum profit. Those 500 men and women were my friends, the dedicated people who had built the company's physical legacy alongside me with their bare hands. Nolan intended to slaughter their livelihoods just to cover his tracks and secure a heavier payout for himself and Yvonne. The executive looked at his designer watch. He stated that the shareholder vote to ratify the merger was scheduled for exactly 14 days from today. The deadline was absolute. I had exactly 2 weeks to gather the remaining evidence, dismantle my daughter's treacherous allegiance, strip Yvonne of her stolen comforts, and drag Nolan to the federal execution block before 500 innocent families lost their means of survival. The clock had officially started ticking. The fluorescent lights of the downtown municipal mediation center cast a sterile glow over the scuffed mahogany table. I sat perfectly still in a cracked leather chair, waiting for the court-mandated divorce proceedings to begin. The heavy wooden door swung open, hitting the rubber wall stop with a loud thud. Yvonne walked into the small windowless room. She wore a tailored white pantsuit and a heavy diamond necklace that caught the harsh overhead light. Those stones were bought with embezzled research and development funds paid for by the sweat of the engineering team she always looked down upon. Nolan followed closely behind her. He did not belong in a family law proceeding, but he pulled out the chair next to my wife and sat down with supreme arrogance. He placed a sleek titanium briefcase on the table and introduced himself to the mediator as Yvonne's official financial advisor. The mediator, a tired man with thick glasses and a rumpled suit, glanced at Nolan's corporate credentials and allowed him to remain in the room. I did not object to his presence. I wanted Nolan sitting exactly where I could monitor his every breath. Yvonne did not look at me. She focused entirely on the stack of legal documents the mediator placed in the center of the table. She adjusted her diamond bracelets, complaining loudly about the poor air conditioning in the municipal building. She stated that she had better things to do than sit in a government office with a man who had no future. She reminded the room that she had spent 40 years waiting for me to become someone important, only to realize I would always be just a mechanic in a cheap suit. Nolan placed his hand over hers, offering a sickening display of false comfort. He looked directly at me, daring me to react to his possession of my wife. I maintained absolute silence. My silence was not submission. It was the calm, calculated focus of a predator waiting for the prey to step fully into the snare. The mediator cleared his throat and opened the primary settlement folder. He read aloud the list of assets Yvonne had already seized. The suburban house, the 2 luxury sedans, and the liquidated savings accounts were already legally transferred into her name. The mediator then turned his attention to the remaining marital assets. He stated that Yvonne was now petitioning for the entirety of my company pension. She wanted the monthly disbursements I had earned over 4 decades of loyal engineering work routed directly into her private offshore account. The mediator looked at me with a profound sense of professional pity. He explained that I had the legal right to contest this aggressive demand, which would force the divorce into a lengthy and expensive trial. Nolan leaned across the table, invading my personal space. He inspected the lapels of my faded gray suit with exaggerated disgust. He told me that fighting the petition was a complete waste of municipal resources and my own rapidly dwindling time. He suggested I take a walk down to the local welfare office and apply for food stamps, claiming my technical skill set was too outdated to ever find employment again. He laughed, telling the mediator that a man who spent his life staring at blueprints lacked the vision to navigate the modern corporate world. Yvonne laughed with him, a sharp and cruel sound that echoed off the bare walls. She told the mediator I was always too stubborn to accept my own mediocrity. She claimed the pension was rightfully hers as compensation for putting up with my late nights at the factory. I looked down at the pension release document resting on the scratched wood. I knew that every asset Yvonne claimed today would be mathematically crushed by the impending federal seizure of Nolan's shell corporations. I reached into my jacket pocket and retrieved my heavy silver pen. I did not utter a single word of defense. I did not justify my 40 years of labor. I placed the pen against the signature line and signed away my entire retirement savings with a smooth, unbroken stroke. I slid the paper across the table. Nolan scoffed loudly, calling me a broken man who had finally learned how to surrender to his superiors. The mediator gathered the signed pension documents and moved to the final phase of the settlement. To finalize the absolute separation of assets, Yvonne was required to formally assume the remaining visible debt tied to the suburban estate. This included a minor second mortgage, outstanding property taxes, and a string of credit lines she had opened under her own name to fund her recent shopping sprees. Yvonne barely glanced at the financial figures before picking up her designer pen. She signed the final page with a massive, flourishing signature. She officially locked herself into a legal position where my previous debts were now her sole responsibility. She believed the embezzled corporate funds Nolan was hoarding offshore would easily cover these minor inconveniences. She handed the clipboard back to the mediator, clapping her hands together in a gesture of absolute finality. She declared herself completely free from the dead weight of our 40-year marriage. Nolan leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head. He looked at the stained ceiling tiles and let out a deep, booming laugh. He gloated that his upcoming corporate maneuvers would make Yvonne a billionaire by the end of the fiscal year. He boasted that once his massive corporate merger closed, the company's assets would be utterly untouchable by any local jurisdiction or domestic audit. He painted a picture of absolute financial invincibility. He sat there radiating power, completely unaware that his primary software vendor was currently being bought out by my attorneys, and his chief financial officer had already sold him out to the new majority shareholder sitting directly across the mediation table. Nolan's ego demanded a grand finale. He could not simply win the mediation. He wanted to ensure I understood the sheer unstoppable scale of my defeat. He leaned forward again, tapping his expensive platinum watch against the glass table to command my attention. He told me I should tune into the financial news networks this coming Friday morning to witness history. In a moment of spectacular, unbridled arrogance, he explicitly stated that the final board meeting to ratify the global merger would take place on the 55th floor of the prestigious Apex Tower downtown, exactly at 9 o'clock. He bragged that the ink would be dry on the merger documents before I even finished my morning bus ride to the unemployment office. He turned to Yvonne and told her to secure a dinner reservation at the city's finest restaurant to celebrate the flawless execution of his corporate masterpiece. I looked down at my hands, carefully hiding the sharp smile forming on my lips. Nolan had just handed me the exact location, the specific floor, and the precise hour of his final move. He had drawn the map to his own execution. I now had the exact coordinates required to drop the hammer. The thin wooden door of room 12 rattled violently against its frame. The deadbolt groaned under the sudden impact of a heavy boot. Wyatt kicked the door a second time, shattering the cheap brass chain lock I had secured just an hour prior. The door flew open, hitting the drywall with a resounding crack. Wyatt stormed into the cramped motel room. He brought the cold rain and the scent of expensive cologne into my dismal sanctuary. He brought his arrogance. He brought his desperation. He brought his unyielding sense of entitlement. Tamara walked in right behind him, wrapping her designer trench coat tightly around her shoulders. She looked around the dingy room, staring at the peeling wallpaper and the stained carpet, her face contorted in absolute disgust. She looked at the sagging mattress. She looked at the flickering fluorescent light. She looked at me, sitting in the corner chair with zero sympathy in her eyes. She did not ask if I was safe. She did not ask if I was hungry. She did not ask if her father was surviving the brutal eviction her mother had orchestrated. Wyatt paced the short length of the room. His tech startup was bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate. Nolan's angel investment was a temporary bandage on a fatal arterial wound. Wyatt needed more cash to keep his servers running and his illusion alive. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick legal document. He marched directly to the bed and slammed the paperwork down onto the cheap floral bedspread. It was a quitclaim deed. He stared at me, his chest heaving with manic energy. The young man stood in my rented slum, fully prepared to strip the last remaining meat from my bones. Wyatt pointed a shaking finger at the quitclaim deed. He demanded my signature immediately. He demanded I hand over the 50 acres of rural Georgia farmland I had inherited from my grandfather over 3 decades ago. That land was my anchor. That land was my heritage. That land was the last physical connection to my family name. Wyatt did not care about my history. He only cared about his collapsing venture. He explained his extortion with rapid, breathless justification. He told me he was using the rural acreage as physical collateral for a massive high-interest business loan. He needed the bank's capital injection by tomorrow morning to satisfy his angry creditors. Tamara stepped forward, aligning herself shoulder to shoulder with the man bleeding our family dry. She looked down at me with an icy, unforgiving glare. She coldly stated that I could no longer afford the annual property taxes anyway. She told me I was financially ruined, utterly destitute, and completely incapable of maintaining the estate. She weaponized my current poverty to justify her husband's theft. She claimed they were doing me a favor by taking the financial burden off my hands. She claimed the land was useless dirt sitting idle while Wyatt's visionary technology company was poised to change the world. She demanded I stop being selfish. She demanded I invest in her future instead of clinging to a dead past. I listened to my own daughter rationalize the complete theft of my legacy. I listened to her dismantle my sacrifices. I listened to her justify my destruction. Wyatt stepped closer, towering over my seated figure. He commanded me to stop stalling. He threatened to have his lawyers seize the property through a protracted legal battle, claiming Yvonne still held a partial marital claim that they could exploit in civil court. He painted a scenario where I would drown in legal fees, lose the land to the state, and die penniless in this very motel room. He believed his aggressive posturing made him formidable. He believed his loud threats made him a predator. He was entirely blind to the fact that his reckless desperation was exactly the mechanism I required to completely destroy him. He wanted the dirt. He wanted the collateral. He wanted the rope to hang himself. I looked at the aggressive stance of the man who had stolen my daughter's loyalty. I looked at the hardened, unfamiliar face of the child I had raised. I did not raise my voice to match their manic volume. I did not plead for the preservation of my grandfather's memory. I simply extended my right hand. I requested a pen. Wyatt blinked momentarily, thrown entirely off balance by my total lack of resistance. He hastily dug a gold-plated pen from his pocket and thrust it into my open palm. I picked up the quitclaim deed from the floral bedspread. I did not read the dense legal paragraphs detailing my complete forfeiture. I pressed the golden pen to the signature line. I signed away the 50 acres of ancestral land with a smooth, decisive stroke. I signed away the dirt. I signed away the heritage. I signed away his entire future. I handed the document back to Wyatt. He snatched the paper from my grasp with greedy, trembling hands. He quickly checked the signature, verified its authenticity, and shoved the deed into his inner coat pocket. He turned his back on me instantly. He did not utter a single word of gratitude. He did not say thank you. He marched straight out the broken door into the rainy night. Tamara lingered for a brief second. She looked at my worn suit and the drab motel walls. She told me to stop being a massive burden on everyone around me. She told me to accept my new reality and fade away quietly. She turned and walked out, leaving the shattered door wide open to the freezing wind. I stood up and walked to the open doorway. I watched the taillights of Wyatt's luxury car pierce the heavy rain as they sped away toward the city. The night swallowed their vehicle, leaving behind a profound, calculated silence. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I opened my encrypted line directly to Hayes. I did not waste time with pleasantries. The execution phase required absolute precision. I issued a single devastating directive to the attorney. I told him to attach the $3 million phantom lien to the rural land deed immediately. I instructed him to activate the dormant commercial debt clause I had secretly buried against that specific property years ago. When Wyatt walks into the bank tomorrow morning and presents that deed as collateral, the financial system will automatically trigger a toxic asset protocol. The bankers will recognize the hidden $3 million deficit attached to the land. Wyatt's attempt to leverage the stolen property will instantly default his current loan agreements. I watched the rain pool on the cracked concrete walkway. When Wyatt takes that paper to the bank tomorrow, his entire company will be seized. Today marked exactly 40 years since I stood at an altar and promised my life to Yvonne. 40 years of shared meals. 40 years of quiet compromises. 40 years of building a family foundation she ultimately decided to shatter. 40 years erased for a penthouse and a corporate parasite. She was not spending our ruby anniversary mourning the death of our marriage. She was broadcasting its execution. My smartphone illuminated the dark interior of my rented sedan with a live social media feed. Yvonne's face filled the glowing screen. She was radiant, flushed with expensive champagne and the raw thrill of her stolen victory. She panned the camera around the room, showcasing the panoramic city skyline and the cascading crystal chandeliers. She and Nolan had rented out the entire top floor of Le Rêve, the most exclusive and notoriously expensive dining establishment in the financial district. Yvonne smiled directly into the lens, raising a delicate platinum flute. She announced to her hundreds of digital followers that she was celebrating a spectacular new era. She leaned into Nolan, pressing her cheek against his tailored tuxedo jacket. He kissed her temple, his eyes gleaming with the arrogant certainty of a man who believed he had conquered the world using another man's wallet. The live stream captured the absolute excess of their celebration. Waiters hovered in the background, carrying silver trays of imported caviar and rare vintage wine. They were feasting on the spoils of my labor. They were toasting to my supposed destruction. I watched her laugh, a bright melodic sound that used to bring me deep comfort. That laugh was now a weapon. She wanted the world to see her triumph. She wanted me to watch her thrive in the ashes of our past. I did not close the application. I watched every single frame. I sat in the driver's seat of the rented sedan parked directly across the rain-slicked avenue from Le Rêve. The towering glass facade of the restaurant glowed warmly against the freezing night, a beacon of untouchable luxury. Through the top-floor windows, I could just make out the silhouettes of the patrons moving beneath the expensive lighting. I could see the exact table where my former wife sat, celebrating my ruin. I did not scream. I did not storm the building. I did not demand closure. I simply reached over to the passenger seat and picked up a heavy black leather binder. The leather was cold to the touch. The contents were pure, concentrated power. I turned on the small overhead cabin light to cut through the shadows. I opened the binder and bypassed the banking ledgers. I bypassed the corporate acquisition files. I turned directly to the commercial real estate holdings section of my newly activated offshore trust. The pages were crisp, filled with dense legal terminology and municipal property codes. My forensic accountants had executed Hayes's directives with terrifying, relentless speed. Nolan and Yvonne believed they were sitting at the absolute pinnacle of high society. They believed their stolen wealth made them invincible. They believed they were dining as royalty in a kingdom they had successfully conquered. I traced my finger down the master list of physical assets now completely under my legal control. The silent adjustment was no longer confined to digital bank accounts and corporate boardrooms. It had manifested into concrete steel and prime commercial real estate. I stared at the glowing windows of the restaurant. They were breathing my air. They were sitting under my roof. The illusion of their grand victory was merely a temporary lease I had silently allowed them to hold. I flipped to the third page of the property registry. I needed absolute verification before dropping the blade. My finger stopped on a freshly filed deed of trust. The heavy black ink on the pristine white paper confirmed the vital, devastating fact. The massive commercial skyscraper towering above me, the exact architectural marvel housing Le Rêve, had been quietly purchased by my holding company exactly 3 days ago. I owned the structural foundation. I owned the cascading crystal chandeliers. I owned the very glass she was currently drinking from. Nolan was a man who prided himself on corporate dominance, yet he had blindly brought his stolen prize into the heart of my newly acquired territory. He was bleeding the company's research budget dry to cover his tracks, completely unaware that his enemy had already bought the ground beneath his feet. The restaurant leased its top-floor space directly from the building's primary owner. The commercial lease agreement gave the property owner absolute, unquestionable authority over the tenant's operational protocols. I looked back up at the glowing 55th floor. Yvonne was likely ordering her fourth bottle of vintage champagne, completely certain that her new financial advisor would effortlessly cover the exorbitant bill. She was enjoying the ultimate VIP treatment, heavily insulated by Nolan's fraudulent corporate status. They felt utterly safe. They felt entirely untouchable. They felt totally removed from the consequences of their betrayal. I closed the leather binder. The heavy sound of the cover snapping shut echoed loudly in the quiet cabin of the sedan. The time for silent observation had expired. The time for ruthless execution had arrived. I picked up my smartphone and dialed the direct private line for the general manager of Le Rev. The line rang twice before a polished, highly professional voice answered. I did not offer polite greetings. I stated my name and my newly registered corporate entity. I informed him that I was the new primary property owner. I instructed the manager to verify my credentials immediately on his internal terminal. 10 seconds later, the manager's tone shifted into total, breathless subservience. I delivered my absolute directives. I ordered him to cancel every single corporate VIP comp currently applied to Table 1. I commanded him to walk up to the top floor and present the itemized bill immediately. I told him to force them to pay the $15,000 minimum room spend on the spot. I explicitly instructed him to decline any personal checks and unequivocally reject any corporate credit accounts linked to Nolan's name. I wanted the panic. I wanted the humiliation. I wanted the reality of their stolen finances to publicly crash down upon them in the middle of their grand celebration. I hung up the phone and watched the top floor, waiting for the shadows to shift. The general manager of Le Rev approached Table 1 with the solemn precision of an executioner. The top floor was a symphony of clinking crystal and hushed, wealthy conversations, heavily insulated from the freezing rain outside. Yvonne sat at the center of the spectacle, her neck heavy with diamonds bought on stolen corporate credit. Nolan held court, raising his glass to toast his own manufactured brilliance. The manager did not smile. He did not offer the usual sycophantic praise reserved for high-rolling guests. He placed a heavy black leather folio directly in front of Nolan, intentionally interrupting a boastful anecdote about the upcoming merger. Nolan waved his hand dismissively, intensely annoyed by the intrusion. He barely glanced at the itemized receipt before pulling a solid platinum personal credit card from his tailored jacket. He tossed the card onto the silver tray with a smug, arrogant smirk, fully expecting the manager to bow and disappear. The $15,000 minimum room charge was supposed to be a rounding error in his grand illusion of wealth. The manager picked up the tray without a single word of deference and retreated to the cashier's station. Yvonne leaned into Nolan, whispering something in his ear that made him laugh loudly. 2 agonizing minutes passed. The manager returned his footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. He placed the black folio back on the table. He leaned down, his voice perfectly polite but utterly devoid of warmth. He informed Nolan that the institution's merchant system had declined the transaction. The platinum card was invalid. Nolan scoffed, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He loudly accused the manager of operating faulty equipment. He snatched the folio, his face flushing with the first sudden sting of public humiliation. Nolan pulled out his designer wallet, his movements losing their previous fluid confidence. He extracted a black titanium card, slapping it onto the table with an aggressive flick of his wrist. He ordered the manager to run the secondary account and to immediately bring a complimentary bottle of their best reserve vintage for the inconvenience. The manager did not move to fetch the wine. He took the heavy metal card and walked back to the terminal with absolute stoicism. 5 minutes later, the manager returned. He placed the black titanium card next to the platinum one. Declined. Nolan's face morphed from irritation into genuine unfiltered shock. He fumbled through his wallet, his fingers suddenly clumsy and uncoordinated. He produced 2 more elite credit cards, his voice rising in pitch and volume as he demanded the manager stop playing games. The manager processed both cards simultaneously. Both were rejected instantly by the financial clearinghouse. Hayes had executed his legal maneuvers flawlessly. My attorney had leveraged the pristine offshore forensic data to flag Nolan's entire personal financial network for highly suspicious international activity. The banking algorithms had automatically triggered a hard freeze on every single line of credit bearing Nolan's name, locking his accounts behind an impenetrable wall of federal anti-fraud protocols. The rising tension at Table 1 rippled across the exclusive dining room. The surrounding patrons, the city's financial elite, stopped their quiet conversations. Cold, judgmental eyes turned toward the commotion. The hushed whispers of high society replaced the clinking of crystal. Tamara sat rigidly in her chair, her face burning crimson as she noticed the intense stares of the other wealthy guests. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably, staring down at his empty plate, realizing the man who had promised to fund his failing startup could not even pay for a celebratory dinner. The absolute embarrassment was suffocating. Yvonne grabbed Nolan's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into his expensive sleeve. The massive diamonds around her neck suddenly looked heavy and ridiculous. She hissed at him through clenched teeth, demanding he fix the catastrophic situation immediately. She reminded him that they were celebrating their new era, not auditioning for a public bankruptcy hearing. Her voice trembled with the terrifying realization that her golden ticket was currently bouncing checks in front of the most powerful people in the city. The absolute terror of public disgrace completely overrode Nolan's sense of self-preservation. He looked around the dining room, seeing the judgmental stares of the corporate executives he desperately wanted to impress. He looked at Tamara and Wyatt, who were visibly pulling away from the sinking ship to distance themselves from the radioactive embarrassment. He looked at Yvonne, whose previous adoration was evaporating into furious, undisguised panic. He could not tolerate the humiliation. He could not let the illusion of his absolute supremacy shatter in the middle of his grandest performance. He reached into the deepest hidden compartment of his leather wallet. He pulled out a dark blue plastic card. It was not a personal line of credit. It was the primary corporate expense account assigned directly to the chief executive officer for strictly approved corporate functions. Using this card to cover a personal $15,000 luxury dinner while the company was undergoing a highly scrutinized merger was a direct violation of federal corporate governance. It was explicit documented theft. It was the misappropriation of shareholder funds. Nolan knew the severe legal risks, but his monumental vanity demanded an immediate sacrifice. He handed the dark blue card to the manager, aggressively instructing him to process the charge and close the account without further delay. The manager nodded, a ghost of a knowing smile playing on his lips, and walked away. The transaction cleared the corporate servers instantly, bypassing personal credit checks and drawing directly from the company's operational capital. The manager returned with the final printed receipt and a heavy brass pen. Nolan grabbed the pen. He did not hesitate. He did not consider the massive digital audit trail he was creating. He dragged the ink across the signature line, officially and legally binding himself to the fraudulent transaction. He threw the pen onto the table, adjusting his collar to regain his shattered composure, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own corporate death warrant. I sat in the dark cabin of my rented sedan, the engine idling quietly against the freezing rain. The shadows wrapped around me, providing a stark contrast to the brilliant, agonizing light spilling from the 55th floor of my newly acquired building. The digital screen mounted on the dashboard suddenly illuminated the interior. A secure, encrypted notification chimed softly in the silent car. I picked up my tablet. The chief financial officer had maintained his end of our newly forged alliance with absolute perfection. He had bypassed the internal accounting delay and forwarded the raw transaction data directly to my private server. I opened the file. A high-resolution scan of the restaurant receipt materialized on my screen, automatically cross-referenced against the internal corporate audits stored in the encrypted databases under Kichban Ong Da Den 2_12.docx and Kichban Ong Da Den Mao 1_12.docx. I saw the $15,000 total. I saw the dark blue corporate card number. I saw Nolan's arrogant, sweeping signature verifying the theft in permanent black ink. Nolan had just committed documented corporate wire fraud on a grand scale, leaving a pristine, undeniable paper trail across state lines. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. I locked the tablet and shifted the sedan into drive. The smartphone resting on the rusted metal table vibrated violently, shattering the oppressive silence of room 12. The cracked digital screen displayed an incoming video call request from Yvonne. I accepted the connection immediately. I did not speak a single word. I simply watched the high-definition image resolve into crystal clarity. Yvonne filled the screen, standing triumphantly in the center of an aggressively modern $5 million penthouse. The background was a staggering expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an uninterrupted panoramic view of the city's glowing financial district. She wore a flowing silk robe that cost more than a month of my previous engineering salary. She wore the absolute confidence of a woman who believed she had finally outgrown her past. She wore the staggering arrogance of a thief standing proudly on a stolen pedestal. She panned the camera around the massive living space, explicitly ensuring I witnessed the imported Italian marble floors and the custom-built mahogany bar. She pointed the lens down at the sprawling city traffic far below, then turned it back to her own face. She laughed. It was a sharp, calculating laugh specifically designed to inflict humiliation. She noted the peeling floral wallpaper visible directly behind my shoulder. She noted the flickering fluorescent light casting a jaundiced, sickly glow over my face. She noted the sheer, undeniable squalor of my $40-a-night motel room. She told me I looked exactly where I belonged. She told me the smell of cheap bleach and failure translated perfectly through the digital connection. She told me she was finally breathing rare air that did not reek of my endless mediocrity. She wanted a visible reaction. She wanted me to scream at the screen. She wanted me to beg for a microscopic scrap of the wealth she had stolen from my accounts. I offered her nothing. I maintained a completely blank, unreadable expression. The utter lack of emotional resistance visibly frustrated her. She scoffed, calling me a pathetic broken shell of a man, and abruptly severed the connection. I set the phone face down on the rusted metal table. The screen went dark instantly, erasing her face, erasing her hollow gloating, erasing her entirely from my immediate focus. I turned my attention back to the towering stack of legal documents Hayes had delivered by courier 20 minutes prior. The motel room was dead quiet again, save for the rhythmic, steady hum of the freezing rain against the single exterior window. I reached for my heavy silver pen. I did not dwell on her petty insults. I did not dwell on her stolen silk robe. I did not dwell on the fragile illusion of her invincibility. I dwelt exclusively on the massive acquisition strategy laid out before me. The documents detailed the entire corporate structure of Pinnacle Ascendancy, the elite property management firm that exclusively owned and operated the residential luxury tower where Yvonne currently resided. Pinnacle Ascendancy was a privately held entity, heavily leveraged by recent expansion and highly vulnerable to a massive sudden influx of hostile capital. My forensic accountants had spent the last 48 hours surgically isolating the firm's specific debt obligations. My new offshore trust had spent the last 24 hours aggressively buying out those exact obligations directly from their respective commercial lenders. I flipped to the master transfer agreement. The paperwork was dense, unforgiving, and absolutely lethal in its scope. It outlined the complete acquisition of Pinnacle Ascendancy's primary voting shares. By purchasing their suffocating debt and converting it instantly into majority equity, my holding company was executing a flawless, unstoppable, hostile takeover. I read through the strict municipal zoning codes. I read through the complex residential bylaws. I read through the exact luxury lease agreement Yvonne had proudly signed just a week ago, utilizing Nolan's heavily scrutinized corporate funds. She had signed a standard luxury lease completely unaware that the financial ground beneath her imported marble floors was rapidly shifting. She believed her penthouse was an untouchable fortress. She believed the sheer elevation protected her from the brutal consequences of the ground floor. She believed Nolan's money created an impenetrable shield around her new life. She was entirely wrong. The glass tower was not a fortress. The glass tower was a suspended glass cage. I aligned the thick edges of the heavy parchment. I smoothed the center crease of the final signature page. The entire acquisition was just one pen stroke away from absolute irrevocable finality. I pressed the silver nib of the pen against the thick parchment. I signed my name with deliberate, unhurried precision. I signed away the corporate independence of Pinnacle Ascendancy. I signed my absolute authority into the deep steel bedrock of the residential tower. I signed my name and officially became the paramount legal landlord of the $5 million penthouse Yvonne was currently parading around in. I placed the cap back on the pen with a sharp click. I picked up my encrypted smartphone and dialed Hayes directly. The attorney answered on the very first ring, his voice crisp and ready. I informed him that the acquisition documents were fully executed and legally binding. I instructed him to file the transfer of ownership with the city clerk immediately upon the opening of municipal offices tomorrow morning. I did not stop there. Mere ownership was only the foundation. The actual execution required a highly specific targeted mechanism. I ordered Hayes to instantly invoke the paramount owner's privilege outlined in Section 4 of the commercial bylaws. I instructed him to mandate an immediate system-wide update to all residential leases within that specific tower. The update was to include a new draconian clause regarding tenant financial liability. If any tenant's primary funding source was officially flagged for federal fraud, or if their listed financial guarantor faced sudden corporate seizure, the building management held the unilateral right to execute an emergency eviction. Not a standard 30-day notice, not a protracted legal mediation period, a brutal, uncompromising 24-hour eviction protocol. Hayes confirmed the directive, noting that the management software could push the updated terms to all residents within the hour as a mandatory digital addendum. I ended the call. I looked around the peeling wallpaper of my motel room. The squalor was no longer a disguise to hide my movements. It was a front-row seat to the impending collapse. High above the city, safely locked inside a sanctuary built entirely on stolen corporate funds, Yvonne's smartphone chimed with a gentle melodic alert. She lounged gracefully on her imported white leather sofa, swirling a fresh glass of expensive vintage champagne. She picked up the device, her eyes casually scanning the glowing notification screen. It was an automated high-priority email originating from Pinnacle Ascendancy Management. The bold subject line indicated a mandatory update to residential lease protocols, highlighting the immediate activation of a strict 24-hour emergency eviction clause directly tied to financial guarantor stability. Yvonne skimmed the first two sentences. She did not comprehend the impending legal peril. She did not recognize the steel snare closing tightly around her ankle. She felt the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, a physical reminder of her new reality. She looked across the massive room at Nolan, who was currently yelling at an executive assistant over the phone regarding merger logistics. She believed his wealth was an infinite, untouchable resource. She believed she was married to a corporate king who could simply buy their way out of any minor administrative inconvenience. With a dismissive roll of her eyes, she pressed her manicured finger against the digital screen. She deleted the email permanently without reading the final terms. She set the phone face down on the glass coffee table, completely and utterly confident that Nolan's money made her invincible. The glow of my tablet screen illuminated the peeling floral wallpaper of the motel room. I sat perfectly still in the sagging chair watching a high-definition live stream of Wyatt's grand technological debut. He had rented a cavernous exposed brick convention space in the city's trendiest warehouse district, sparing no expense to project the image of staggering success. He stood center stage wearing a tailored midnight blue suit, pacing back and forth with a sleek wireless microphone headset strapped to his jaw. He looked exactly like the visionary billionaire he desperately pretended to be. Hundreds of journalists, technology bloggers, and eager angel investors filled the neatly arranged rows of folding chairs, their camera flashes popping in rapid, blinding succession. Tamara stood just off to the side of the main stage wearing a sharp designer dress, smiling radiantly for the press corps. She was vigorously applauding her husband's manufactured brilliance, completely blind to the reality that his entire digital empire was heavily mortgaged against a piece of rural dirt she had mocked just days prior. Wyatt stopped pacing and raised both hands to silence the adoring crowd. He delivered a highly rehearsed, passionate speech about changing the digital landscape, disrupting the industry, and leaving a permanent legacy. Behind him, a massive 50-foot LED screen displayed the startup's stylized logo in brilliant color. He signaled for his lead software developers to join him on stage. He placed his hand ceremoniously over a large glowing digital button that would officially take the application's servers live to a global audience. The crowd began a deafening unified 10-second countdown. Wyatt looked directly into the primary broadcast camera, flashing a blinding, arrogant smile. He brought his hand down hard, striking the button. The massive LED screen behind him erupted in a brilliant flash of pure white light, then instantly snapped into pitch black. The heavy thumping bass of the venue's expensive sound system cut out with a sharp, violent electrical pop. The entire convention space plunged into absolute dead silence. Wyatt tapped his wireless microphone twice. The device was dead. He chuckled nervously, flashing a strained, unconvincing smile at the front row of journalists, assuming this was a minor, easily fixable theatrical glitch. It was not a glitch. It was an execution. My phone buzzed on the rusted metal table. It was a sterile automated confirmation email from Hayes. The primary software vendor currently supplying the entire cloud infrastructure and server hosting for Wyatt's startup had just executed my direct legal orders. I had bought that vendor completely out from under him 48 hours ago. The exact moment Wyatt pressed the launch button, the vendor initiated a total, system-wide termination protocol. Wyatt's lead developer rushed onto the stage from the production wing. The young man was pale, sweating profusely and clutching a vibrating tablet to his chest. He grabbed Wyatt's arm and whispered frantically into his ear. I watched Wyatt's arrogant smile instantly dissolve into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The developer explained that the servers had not simply crashed due to traffic. The hosting vendor had deliberately pulled the plug, severing all data streams and locking the startup out of its own digital architecture. The vendor had cited an immediate catastrophic breach of financial trust. They had frozen the proprietary code, seized the user databases, and locked the entire platform behind an impenetrable federal firewall. Wyatt grabbed the developer by the collar, his face flushed with panic, demanding they switch immediately to the backup servers. The developer shook his head rapidly. There were no backup servers. The global launch was dead on arrival. The journalists in the front row instantly recognized the disaster and began typing furiously on their laptops. The flashing cameras that had celebrated his arrival were now mercilessly documenting his highly public humiliation. Tamara's smile vanished completely. She stared at her husband in horror, the reality of his monumental failure broadcasting live to the world. Before Wyatt could formulate a lie to pacify the restless media, his personal smartphone began to vibrate violently inside his suit pocket. He pulled the device out, his eyes widening as he recognized the incoming caller ID. It was his primary commercial banker. He stumbled backward, ignoring the shouting journalists demanding answers, and rushed off the stage into the darkened wings of the convention center. The bank was not calling to congratulate him on his launch. They were calling to inform him of his absolute financial annihilation. The quitclaim deed he had so eagerly snatched from my hands the previous night had been processed by the underwriting department at dawn. Wyatt had confidently presented my 50 acres of rural land as pristine, debt-free collateral to secure a massive high-interest commercial loan. He believed he was trading dead dirt for corporate salvation. He did not know that I had legally attached a $3 million phantom lien to that exact deed decades ago as a protective corporate measure. The moment the bank scanned the property deed into their central financial system, the banking algorithms triggered a severe toxic asset protocol. The banker coldly informed Wyatt that his collateral was not only entirely worthless, but deeply negative. Wyatt's aggressive attempt to leverage heavily encumbered property constituted a direct, unforgivable violation of his commercial lending covenants. The bank had instantly executed their emergency retrieval rights. They froze every single corporate account tied to his name. His operational capital vanished, his payroll accounts were seized, his personal credit lines were locked down permanently. Wyatt stood in the shadows of the convention center, pressing the phone to his ear, listening to the banker read the relentless termination clauses. He was instantly, irrevocably bankrupt. He had no servers, no application, and zero capital. He was a fraud exposed under the brightest possible lights, left with nothing but the suffocating weight of his own hubris. Absolute desperation completely shattered Wyatt's remaining sanity. He fled the warehouse district in a total panic, abandoning his wife and his ruined company to the wolves of the press. I switched the live feed on my tablet, tapping directly into the internal security cameras of the Apex Tower executive floor, courtesy of my newly allied chief financial officer. I watched Wyatt practically tear the heavy glass doors off their hinges as he burst into Nolan's private corner office. Wyatt looked entirely feral. He was sweating heavily through his expensive suit, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and manic. He slammed his fists onto Nolan's immaculate mahogany desk, screaming demands for an immediate $500,000 corporate bailout. He shouted that the bank was preparing to press criminal fraud charges by nightfall if his accounts were not stabilized. Nolan recoiled, absolutely terrified of the chaotic, volatile scene Wyatt was causing just days before the highly sensitive shareholder merger vote. Nolan knew the noise and the desperation could easily attract the unwanted attention of the board of directors. Acting on pure, reactive panic to protect his own crumbling empire, Nolan turned to his secure desktop terminal. He rapidly bypassed the standard internal accounting protocols and authorized a heavily encrypted, highly illegal wire transfer. He moved $500,000 from the corporate operational reserve directly into Wyatt's freezing accounts to buy the desperate man's silence. Exactly one floor below, sitting in the quiet, climate-controlled hum of the server room, the chief financial officer calmly watched his monitoring software light up. He documented the timestamp, the routing numbers, and the point of origin. He expertly captured every single keystroke of the illicit corporate transaction. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B closed with a dull final thud. The air inside was completely sterile, smelling faintly of lemon polish and decades of broken promises. Judge Harrison sat elevated behind the massive wooden bench, peering down through thick reading glasses at the dense stack of legal documents detailing my absolute ruin. He adjusted his heavy black robes and looked directly at me. He looked at my worn, threadbare suit. He looked at my calm, unshaken demeanor. He asked me a single pointed question. He asked if I fully comprehended the severe magnitude of the settlement agreement resting before him. He wanted to ensure I understood the total finality of the contract. He wanted to make sure I recognized that I was legally walking away with absolutely nothing. No alimony, no property, no shared assets, no claim to the marital accounts. I was forfeiting 4 decades of relentless financial contribution in a single binding stroke. Yvonne sat at the opposite table, flanked by 2 expensive, highly aggressive divorce attorneys. She sat perfectly upright, radiating an aura of total superiority. She wore a tailored crimson dress that signaled absolute, undeniable victory. She watched me intently, waiting for a final display of weakness. She waited for me to beg for a fraction of my own wealth. She waited for me to contest the blatant inequity of the division. She waited for the emotional breakdown she felt she was fundamentally owed. I did not give her the satisfaction. I stood up, buttoning my frayed jacket. I looked the judge directly in the eye. I stated clearly and unequivocally for the official court record that I understood the terms completely. I confirmed my absolute agreement to the total forfeiture. I confirmed that I wanted nothing from her. I confirmed that the execution of this specific document was exactly what I required to finalize the trap. The judge sighed, shaking his head at what he perceived as a man surrendering to total defeat. He did not know I was not surrendering. I was simply clearing the battlefield. Judge Harrison raised his heavy wooden gavel. He brought it down against the sounding block with a sharp, resounding crack that echoed off the high plaster ceilings. He officially pronounced the marriage dissolved. The legal tether that had bound my life to Yvonne for 40 years was permanently severed. Yvonne let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pure, unfiltered triumph. She stood up immediately, ignoring the quiet, somber decorum of the courtroom. She snatched the freshly stamped divorce decree from her lead attorney's hands. She waved the thick parchment in the air, her face flushed with the manic energy of a predator that had successfully consumed its prey without facing a single consequence. She walked deliberately across the center aisle, closing the physical distance between our tables. She stopped just inches from my chest. Her expensive, heavy perfume momentarily masked the sterile smell of the courtroom. She looked at me with eyes entirely devoid of history, devoid of affection, and devoid of any basic human empathy. She told me I was officially a ghost. She told me my existence was completely erased from her brilliant new reality. She stated that I was nothing more than a bad memory she had successfully expunged from the permanent record. She wanted her absolute cruelty to be the final word of our shared history. She reached into her designer leather handbag. She pulled out a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. She crumpled the green paper in her fist, crushing the portrait into a tight, wrinkled ball. She dropped the crumpled money directly onto the polished floor. It landed softly against the toe of my scuffed leather shoe. She told me to buy myself a cheap, pathetic meal and disappear into the gutter where I belonged. She told me to accept my new poverty. She told me to never contact her, never look for her, and never dare to exist in her presence again. She turned her back on me instantly, laughing loudly with her attorneys as they gathered their briefcases. She walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She fully believed she had stripped me of my dignity, my wealth, and my entire future. She walked out believing the crumpled bill was a symbol of my total destruction. I stood perfectly still in the empty aisle of the courtroom. The crumpled $100 bill rested against my shoe, a pathetic green monument to her supreme, blinding arrogance. The court stenographer watched me with eyes full of quiet, awkward pity. The armed bailiff shifted uncomfortably by the heavy wooden door, fully expecting me to bend down and claim the discarded, humiliating charity. I did not look down at the money. I did not acknowledge the profound insult. I did not bend my spine for a woman who had spent the last calendar year actively trying to break it. I reached down and picked up my worn canvas bag from the wooden chair. The heavy canvas was frayed at the edges, holding nothing but a few legal folders and the quiet ironclad certainty of my impending retaliation. I turned and walked straight toward the heavy mahogany doors. I stepped right over the crumpled $100 bill, leaving it abandoned and useless on the polished floor. I pushed the courtroom doors open and stepped out into the expansive, echoing marble hallway. I walked down the grand, sweeping staircase of the county courthouse. I walked with perfect posture. I walked with my head held high. I walked with the deliberate, measured cadence of a man who knew exactly where he was going. The air outside was crisp, biting, and incredibly clear. The heavy, suffocating clouds from the previous week had finally broken, leaving behind a sharp, unforgiving sky. I descended the final stone step and merged into the bustling city traffic. I was officially a ghost in Yvonne's eyes. Being a ghost was exactly the tactical advantage I required for the final maneuver. Ghosts are entirely invisible. Ghosts make absolutely no sound. Ghosts cannot be stopped by locked doors, high-security penthouses, or heavily encrypted corporate firewalls. A sleek, black luxury town car idled quietly at the curb, its heavily tinted windows concealing the interior from the busy street. I opened the heavy rear door and slid onto the pristine leather seat. Hayes sat beside me, dressed in a flawless charcoal suit, his expression a mask of pure predatory focus. He did not ask how the divorce proceedings had concluded. He knew the emotional severance was entirely irrelevant to the impending corporate slaughter. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, meticulously bound dossier. He handed me the finalized board packet. I felt the dense, undeniable weight of the paper in my hands. The documents contained the fully executed voting proxies, the hostile acquisition manifests, and the incontrovertible, damning proof of Nolan's massive wire fraud. It was day 59. The clock had aggressively ticked down to its absolute final hours. I opened the packet and verified the printed agenda. The emergency shareholder meeting to decide the ultimate fate of the company was officially set for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I looked out the tinted window at the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. Tomorrow morning, the ghost would finally make himself known. The heavy reinforced tires of the midnight black Maybach hissed steadily against the damp, freezing pavement of the financial district. The vehicle glided to a flawless, completely silent halt directly in front of the towering glass facade of the corporate headquarters. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. The city was awake, moving with its usual frantic, desperate energy. But inside the soundproof, climate-controlled cabin of the luxury vehicle, there was only absolute, razor-sharp focus. I did not wear the frayed, ill-fitting garments of a discarded, forgotten husband. I did not wear the tired, broken posture of a financially ruined man. I did not wear the despair Yvonne so desperately wanted to imprint upon my soul. I wore a custom-tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that draped over my shoulders like heavy armor. The fabric was immaculate. The cut was precise. The physical transformation was a direct reflection of my newly consolidated power. I reached out and pushed the heavy leather door open. I stepped out onto the polished concrete of the executive drop-off zone. The biting morning wind hit my face, but I felt absolutely no chill. I felt the heat of 40 years of accumulated, weaponized knowledge. I felt the burning, unstoppable engine of a perfectly executed financial strategy. I felt the undeniable, absolute authority of a man returning to reclaim his stolen kingdom. I closed the car door behind me with a solid, definitive thud. I did not look back at the busy street. I did not look back at the pathetic motel room I had left behind. I walked directly toward the towering, revolving glass doors of the primary entrance. Every single step was calculated. Every single movement was deliberate. I was not a ghost fading into the miserable shadows of the city. I was the architect of their impending destruction. The massive main corporate lobby was a cavern of polished white Italian marble and brushed stainless steel. It was designed specifically to intimidate. It was designed to make the average hardworking employee feel small and entirely inconsequential beneath the towering 3-story vaulted ceiling. I walked across the vast echoing floor without altering my measured predatory stride. My leather shoes struck the pristine marble with a heavy, rhythmic, unyielding cadence. The primary security checkpoint loomed directly ahead, a reinforced barricade of sleek electronic turnstiles guarded by a highly trained team of uniformed personnel. The head of corporate security stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he recognized my face from the outdated, humiliating termination files Nolan had eagerly distributed to the entire building months ago. The security chief was a large, imposing man explicitly trained to recognize physical threats and eliminate them instantly. He stepped directly into my path, firmly planting his boots to block the central executive turnstile. He raised a heavy, authoritative hand. He demanded I stop immediately. He loudly declared that I was a terminated, disgraced employee. He stated that my presence in the building constituted an illegal, highly actionable corporate trespass. He threatened to have his armed team physically remove me from the premises and throw me onto the street if I dared to take another step forward. He believed his dark uniform granted him absolute power. He believed his close proximity to the executive suite made him an untouchable enforcer. He believed Nolan's fraudulent directives were absolute, unquestionable law. I did not stop. I did not slow my pace. I did not break my cold, unyielding gaze. I continued walking directly toward his raised hand, forcing him to either hold his aggressive ground or step aside. The atmospheric tension in the lobby spiked sharply. Dozens of arriving employees stopped in their tracks, their morning coffees forgotten, turning to watch the impending physical collision. The security chief braced his wide shoulders, preparing to forcibly restrain the man he believed was a pathetic, disgruntled, and broken former engineer. He opened his mouth to issue a final aggressive public warning. He was completely unaware that he was standing in the direct path of the primary majority shareholder. He was entirely blind to the absolute fact that his paycheck, his pension, and his very employment were currently resting firmly in the palm of my hand. Before the imposing security chief could lay a single aggressive hand on my tailored suit, a sharp, commanding voice sliced violently through the tense, silent air of the lobby. The chief financial officer strode rapidly across the marble floor, emerging directly from the private gold-plated executive elevators. He moved with a frantic, undeniable, terrifying urgency, carrying a sleek leather portfolio tucked tightly under his arm containing the finalized acquisition manifests, explicitly verified under Kichban Ong Da Den 2_17.docx and the Master Execution Protocols, formerly filed as Kichban Ong Da Den Mao 1_17.docx. He did not look at the armed security guards. He did not acknowledge the growing, whispering crowd of bewildered employees. He walked directly to the central restricted turnstile, inserting himself squarely between my advancing figure and the hostile guard. He bypassed the security chief completely. He pulled a heavy, solid black master keycard from his inner jacket pocket and pressed it firmly against the glowing biometric scanner. The security terminal beeped with a loud, chiming tone of absolute system-wide approval. The reinforced glass gates slid open smoothly, completely and utterly overriding the chief's manual lockdown protocol. The CFO stepped back, creating a clear, unobstructed path for me to enter the inner sanctum. He lowered his eyes to the marble floor. He bowed his head in a highly public gesture of profound, undeniable, absolute respect. He spoke clearly, deliberately, ensuring his voice carried across the dead-silent lobby. "Right this way, Chairman Jameson." The entire security team froze in absolute paralyzing shock. The chief instantly dropped his raised hand, his face draining of all color as the horrific realization of his catastrophic mistake crashed down upon him. He stared at the bowing CFO, then stared at me, his imposing aggressive posture crumbling into utter, breathless terror. He had just threatened to violently assault the paramount owner of the corporation. I did not look at the trembling guard. I walked through the open glass gates. I joined the chief financial officer. We stepped into the private gold-plated executive elevator, leaving the paralyzed lobby completely behind us. On the 50th floor, the atmosphere was entirely disconnected from the shifting, lethal reality unfolding below. Nolan paced back and forth at the head of the massive, polished oak boardroom table. He was delivering a sweeping, impassioned, highly rehearsed victory speech regarding the finalization of the corporate merger. He spoke of infinite capital. He spoke of global industry dominance. He spoke of a brilliant, untouchable future. Yvonne sat directly behind him in the elevated VIP observation gallery flanked by Tamara and Wyatt. They were a perfect portrait of stolen luxury. They were smiling brightly. They were calculating their impending massive wealth. They were completely insulated by their own staggering, blinding arrogance. Nolan raised his hands to command the attention of the seated board members, ready to call for the final rubber stamp vote that would permanently seal his absolute power. He paused. A sound echoed from the private executive corridor outside. It was not the soft tread of a subservient assistant. It was the deliberate, heavy rhythmic strike of leather shoes against the hardwood floor. The sound grew louder. The sound grew closer. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom stood between their grand illusion and my absolute reality. The footsteps stopped directly outside the handle. I placed both hands flat against the polished brass handles of the massive oak doors. I did not hesitate. I pushed forward with a surge of calculated force. The heavy doors swung inward on their frictionless hinges, hitting the interior stoppers with a sound like a thunderclap. The sudden noise instantly shattered the insulated, self-congratulatory atmosphere of the executive boardroom. Nolan was standing at the mahogany podium, his mouth open mid-sentence, his hand raised in a gesture of absolute corporate triumph. The words died in his throat. The entire room of suited board members snapped their heads toward the entrance in synchronized shock. The air conditioning hummed in the sudden suffocating vacuum of silence. I stepped over the threshold into the sprawling sunlit room. I did not look like the discarded, ruined engineer they had been led to expect. I wore the dark armor of my tailored Tom Ford suit, projecting an aura of total, unyielding authority. Nolan's face contorted from absolute shock into a mask of furious, violently defensive rage. He gripped the edges of the podium until his knuckles turned entirely white. He slammed his open palm down against the polished wood, rattling the crystal water glasses resting on the long conference table. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest. He demanded to know how I had bypassed the lobby security protocols. He shouted at the top of his lungs explicitly, ordering the board's private security detail to immediately apprehend the intruder. He screamed that a terminated, mentally unstable former employee was trespassing in a highly restricted corporate zone. He demanded my instant physical removal, desperate to maintain his fractured illusion of total control before his carefully curated audience. The eruption from the elevated VIP gallery was instantaneous and deafening. Yvonne leapt to her feet, her designer heels scraping harshly against the polished floorboards. Her face, previously flushed with the thrill of impending wealth, twisted into a mask of pure venomous outrage. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her voice shrill and echoing off the panoramic glass windows. She screamed that I was a pathetic, delusional stalker incapable of accepting my own irrelevance. She loudly announced to the bewildered board members that I was completely obsessed with her success. A broken man, hopelessly clinging to a woman who had righteously discarded him. She demanded that I stop embarrassing myself and leave the premises before she filed criminal harassment charges. She weaponized her fabricated narrative of my supposed mental breakdown, attempting to assassinate my character in front of the city's financial elite. Sitting directly beside her, Tamara shrank back into her plush leather chair. My daughter covered her face with both hands, visibly radiating waves of profound second-hand embarrassment. She was utterly mortified that her biological father had seemingly arrived to beg for scraps at the pinnacle of her new, luxurious life. She shook her head, whispering frantic apologies to the executives seated nearby, desperate to distance herself from my sudden intrusion. Wyatt sat rigid, his eyes darting frantically between Nolan's panic and my composed entrance, likely calculating how this unforeseen disruption might delay his desperately needed corporate bailout. I did not react to Yvonne's shrieking insults. I did not look at my cowering daughter. I did not acknowledge the frantic whispering of the board members. I treated Yvonne and her entire gallery of sycophants as if they were nothing more than empty air. I ignored their panic entirely. I kept my gaze locked squarely on Nolan. I walked with a slow, deliberate, predatory cadence directly down the center aisle of the boardroom. I moved past the terrified executives. I moved past the shouting woman who had betrayed me. I marched directly toward the head of the massive oak table, entering the absolute center of Nolan's manufactured kingdom. I reached the apex of the room and stopped directly behind the towering, high-backed black leather chair positioned precisely at the head of the table. This was the chairman's seat. It was the physical manifestation of ultimate corporate authority within the company. It was a seat that had remained entirely vacant for the past 6 months, following the sudden, highly convenient retirement of the company's founder. Nolan had aggressively positioned himself as the acting CEO, but he had never possessed the legitimate shareholder equity required to officially occupy this specific chair. He had spent the last half-year circling it, coveting it, and desperately orchestrating fraudulent mergers to finally claim it. I placed my hands on the thick leather armrests. I pulled the heavy chair out the casters, rolling smoothly across the plush executive carpet. I sat down. The leather was firm, unyielding, and perfectly suited to the task at hand. I leaned back, settling into the profound weight of my newly consolidated power. I slowly raised my arms and rested my elbows on the polished mahogany surface. I adjusted the crisp white cuffs of my tailored shirt, ensuring the silver links were perfectly aligned. I folded my hands together. I stared directly into Nolan's eyes. He stood at the podium just a few feet away, practically vibrating with a mixture of intense rage and creeping undeniable terror. The power dynamic within the boardroom inverted instantly. I was no longer the discarded husband or the terminated engineer. I occupied the physical and literal seat of absolute command. I did not need to shout. I simply held his gaze, letting the suffocating gravity of my silent authority completely crush his manufactured arrogance. Before Nolan could issue another frantic, screaming directive to the paralyzed executives, the heavy oak doors swung open a second time. Hayes strode confidently into the boardroom. He was not alone. He was flanked by the exact same two armed corporate security guards who had attempted to block my entrance in the lobby just moments ago. The guards now stood at rigid attention, slightly behind the attorney, their loyalty instantly transferred to the true source of their paychecks. Hayes walked directly to the head of the table. He did not look at Nolan. He dropped a massive, densely bound stack of certified trust documents squarely onto the polished wood. The heavy thud of the paper silenced the remaining whispers in the room. Hayes turned to face the bewildered seated executives. His voice was sharp, professional, and entirely lethal. He formally introduced himself as lead counsel for the primary holding trust. He gestured directly to me. He announced to the entire board of directors that I currently possessed fully verified, legally binding control of exactly 65% of the company's voting shares. He stated with absolute, undeniable clarity that I controlled the room. The sudden heavy thud of the certified trust documents hitting the boardroom table acts as a detonator. The reaction is instantaneous. Nolan's mouth snaps completely shut. The blood rapidly drains from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. In the elevated VIP gallery, Yvonne's fingers go entirely slack. Her heavy designer handbag slips from her grasp, striking the hardwood floor with a dull crack that echoes through the paralyzed room. The senior board members lunge forward. They snatch the thick stacks of parchment from the polished glass surface. The frantic rustling of heavy paper is the only sound. They read the dense legal terminology, their eyes widening with every undeniable clause. The trust signatures are verified. The municipal corporate seals are flawless. The transfer of equity is absolute and irrefutable. Nolan grips the edge of the mahogany podium, his knuckles turning white as he physically struggles to remain upright. The fortress he had built using stolen funds is instantly vaporized. Tamara and Wyatt sit frozen in their plush gallery seats. Wyatt looks like a man about to face a firing squad, the full weight of his impending corporate bankruptcy crashing down on him. Yvonne stares at the empty chairman's seat she had mocked just weeks ago. I am sitting in it. The ghost she had tried to erase is now breathing all the air in her stolen kingdom. The lead board member, a man who had backed Nolan's reckless expansion strategy, drops the master ledger onto the table. He looks at Nolan with absolute disgust. The corporate coup is no longer a threat. It is a finalized execution. The documents explicitly cross-reference the shareholder bylaws detailed within Kichban Ong Da Den 2_21.docx. There is absolutely no legal loophole. The room belongs entirely to me. I do not wait for Nolan to catch his breath. The initial shock is merely the anesthetic before the surgical strike. I reach across the glass table and pick up the sleek black remote control for the boardroom's primary projection system. I press the input override button. On the massive 80-inch display directly behind Nolan, the colorful, optimistic graphs detailing his glorious corporate merger vanish instantly. The screen goes pitch black for exactly 1 second. It erupts into glaring, unforgiving light. The display is filled with high-resolution, unredacted financial forensics. I press the next button. The screen shifts to a massive blown-up scan of a restaurant receipt from Le Rev. The $15,000 total glows in bright red ink. The signature at the bottom belongs unmistakably to Nolan. He had authorized the luxury dining charge on the primary corporate expense account during a strict financial freeze. I look up at Yvonne. She recognizes the receipt from her extravagant champagne-soaked anniversary celebration. The remaining color drains from her cheeks. I press the remote button again. The screen transitions to a far more devastating document. It is a raw, time-stamped digital capture of an illegal corporate wire transfer. The origin point is the company's heavily restricted operational reserve. The destination is a frozen offshore account under Wyatt's name. The amount is exactly $500,000. The transaction log perfectly matches the illicit transfer protocols outlined in Kichban Ong Da Den Mao Mot Gach Dui Hai Mui Mot Cham Docs. Nolan physically stumbles away from the podium. He shields his eyes from the glaring projection as if the light itself is burning his flesh. The board members gasp collectively. The theft is not a rumor. The theft is meticulously documented corporate espionage executed by their acting CEO. Wyatt shrinks down in the gallery, his face buried in his hands, realizing his desperate, illegal bailout has just been broadcast to the entire board of directors. The evidence exposes Nolan's complete lack of fiduciary responsibility. He has bled the company dry to fund his fragile ego and bail out his new parasitic family. The sheer magnitude of the fraud hangs heavy in the sterile air of the boardroom. The silence stretches suffocating and absolute. The shock shatters into absolute violent chaos. The boardroom erupts. 6 senior executives stand up simultaneously, shouting across the polished table. They hurl furious accusations at Nolan, demanding immediate explanations for the grotesque misappropriation of shareholder funds. One board member threatens to call the federal authorities on the spot. Another throws his heavy leather folio against the wall in sheer disgust. Nolan backs into the glowing digital screen, raising his hands in a pathetic, trembling attempt to pacify the enraged executives. He stammers out broken sentences, desperately attempting to formulate a lie, but his voice is completely drowned out by the roaring fury of the betrayed board. I sit perfectly still in the chairman's seat, watching the corporate predators tear their own leader apart. I raise my heavy silver pen. I bring it down against the thick glass surface of the table. A sharp, piercing crack cuts directly through the screaming. The executives stop. They turn to look at the man holding 65% of the voting power. I do not raise my voice. I speak with cold, mechanical precision. I inform the board that the proposed corporate merger is highly toxic. I state that Nolan's grand expansion plan was a desperate smokescreen designed solely to mask his colossal embezzlement. As the majority shareholder, I invoke my absolute right of refusal. I formally and irrevocably veto the corporate merger. The golden parachute Nolan had meticulously woven for himself is instantly shredded. The massive corporate payout he had promised Yvonne vanishes into thin air. He is left standing at the podium with no merger, no company, and a highly publicized trail of federal wire fraud. The devastating reality of the veto settles over the room like wet concrete. Nolan stares at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the raw panic of a man watching the gallows being built directly in front of him. Yvonne clings to the brass railing of the VIP gallery, her knuckles white, her luxurious life dissolving right before her eyes. I lean forward in the heavy leather chair. I press the activation button on the base of the chairman's microphone. The small red indicator light snaps on. My voice echoes cleanly through the integrated sound system, filling every corner of the vast, sunlit room. I do not look at my former wife. I do not look at her terrified daughter or her bankrupt son-in-law. I look straight through Nolan. I announce Item 2 on the official agenda. I initiate an immediate binding shareholder vote to terminate the chief executive officer for gross documented financial misconduct. I did not give the room a single moment to breathe. I did not give Nolan a fraction of a second to formulate a defense, to beg for mercy, or to twist the narrative. I raised my hand and called for the immediate binding vote to terminate the chief executive officer with extreme prejudice. The response from the board was not hesitant. The response from the board was not deliberative. The response from the board was an instantaneous, absolute, unanimous wave of raised hands. The executives who had smiled with him yesterday, the men who had eagerly toasted to his fraudulent success just an hour ago, now practically trampled each other to formally distance themselves from his staggering criminal liability. The vote was recorded. The termination was finalized. The total dissolution of Nolan's empire occurred in less than 10 seconds. Nolan stared at the sea of raised hands. He stared at the complete evaporation of his power. He stared at the absolute death of his legacy, the fragile, highly polished facade he had maintained for a decade violently shattered. He did not issue a legal threat. He did not call for his expensive attorneys. He lost his mind entirely. A primal, guttural scream ripped from his throat, echoing off the panoramic glass windows. He shoved the heavy mahogany podium with such desperate force that it tipped and crashed heavily onto the marble floor. He lunged forward. He charged directly across the length of the massive conference table. his eyes wide and bloodshot, his face contorted into a mask of pure homicidal fury. He raised his right fist, perfectly intent on physically destroying the man who had just dismantled his entire life. He crossed the distance in 3 massive strides, entirely consumed by the blinding rage of a predator, backed into a corner with absolutely no exit. He never reached the head of the table. He never landed the desperate, violent strike. Before Nolan could close the final gap, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom were kicked open with a tremendous, deafening crash that shook the walls. A tactical unit of federal agents and heavily armed financial police surged into the room like a dark, unstoppable tide. They moved with absolute, terrifying precision. They moved with a swift, synchronized violence that instantly froze the remaining air in the room. They wore dark, tactical vests emblazoned with federal insignia, their boots hitting the floor in a rapid, heavy cadence. They flooded the aisles, bypassing the screaming executives, bypassing the overturned podium, and bypassing the petrified gallery where Yvonne stood frozen in absolute terror. 2 massive agents intercepted Nolan in mid-stride. They did not gently detain him. They hit him with the combined devastating force of a speeding freight train, driving him violently backward. Nolan's feet left the plush executive carpet entirely before he was slammed brutally against the solid mahogany paneling of the back wall. The tremendous impact knocked the wind from his lungs with a sharp, sickening wheeze. The agents pinned him against the polished wood, twisting his arms aggressively behind his back with practiced mechanical efficiency. He gasped for air, his cheek pressed flat against the wall, his eyes darting frantically around the room as his absolute defeat became a physical, agonizing reality. The lead federal agent stepped forward into the exact center of the room. He did not raise his voice yet. His cold, authoritarian tone cut perfectly through the chaotic ringing in the boardroom. He looked directly at Nolan's bleeding face. He formally announced the execution of a federal arrest warrant. He pulled a thick document from his vest and read the devastating litany of charges aloud for the entire board of directors to hear. He charged Nolan with multiple counts of aggressive wire fraud. He charged him with staggering corporate embezzlement. He charged him with grand-scale corporate espionage. The agent articulated every single charge with deliberate, excruciating clarity. Each word was a nail sealing Nolan's coffin. Each word was a final judgment. The stolen capital, the falsified ledgers, the illicit offshore transfers, all of it had been handed directly to the federal authorities by my legal team at dawn. The trap had not merely sprung, the trap had entirely consumed him. The cold, heavy steel of federal handcuffs clamped down tightly around Nolan's wrists. The sharp mechanical click echoed through the dead silence of the boardroom like a gunshot. The sound was final. The sound was absolute. The sound represented the total, irrevocable end of his freedom. The agents yanked him backward, pulling him roughly away from the mahogany paneling. Nolan stumbled blindly, his custom-tailored suit jacket torn at the shoulder, his expensive silk tie hanging in ragged, pathetic strips around his neck. The illusion of the untouchable, visionary corporate titan was entirely gone. The mask had been completely ripped away. In his place stood a broken, desperate, weeping criminal facing the absolute reality of his actions. He began to scream. He screamed my name with a raspy, tearing desperation, demanding I stop, the agents demanding I show him mercy. He screamed a barrage of frantic, incoherent threats that dissolved instantly into pathetic, begging pleas. He thrashed against the iron grip of the federal agents, digging his polished leather shoes into the carpet in a futile, humiliating attempt to stop his inevitable extraction. The agents did not slow their pace. They dragged him violently down the center aisle, forcing him past the terrified, silent rows of the executives he had once commanded. They dragged him past the shattered podium. They dragged him past the heavy glass doors. His screams grew faint, echoing down the vast 50th floor corridor, descending rapidly into the bowels of the corporate tower. The noise faded into a hollow, pathetic whimper before vanishing entirely into the hum of the air conditioning. The room was left breathless, vibrating with the sudden, violent vacuum of his permanent removal. Yvonne stood completely paralyzed in the elevated VIP observation gallery. Her hands gripped the brass railing so tightly her knuckles were translucent against her pale skin. She stared blankly at the empty physical space where her powerful, untouchable lover had stood just moments before. The devastating reality of the execution washed over her in a suffocating, icy wave. The math rearranged itself violently in her mind. She realized she had not secured a golden parachute. She realized she had not traded her dull, predictable husband for an elite, visionary titan of industry. She realized with absolute paralyzing clarity that she had traded a quiet, hidden billionaire for a disgraced, ruined felon who was about to spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal penitentiary. Her vast impending wealth was entirely imaginary. Her elite social status was completely dead. The sickening gravity of her monumental miscalculation crushed the air directly from her lungs. She slowly turned her head. She lowered her gaze from the empty space where Nolan had been destroyed. She turned her wide, terrified, trembling eyes directly toward me. Yvonne shattered the frozen silence of the observation gallery. She scrambled down the carpeted stairs, her designer heels catching on the fabric, her previous posture of absolute superiority completely destroyed. She ran directly to the edge of the massive glass table. She slammed her hands against the surface. She began to weep. She wept for her lost status. She wept for her lost money. She wept for the reality that had just evaporated into the sterile boardroom air. She reached out toward me, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She claimed Nolan had entirely manipulated her. She claimed Nolan had forced her hand. She claimed Nolan had poisoned her mind against me. She claimed she had always loved me and had only been confused by his aggressive corporate promises. She begged for forgiveness. She begged for mercy. She begged for a fraction of her old life to be restored. Behind her, the heavy gallery doors burst open. Tamara and Wyatt pushed their way violently past the retreating executives. Wyatt looked entirely feral, his eyes sunken and manic, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He bypassed his weeping mother-in-law and slammed his fists onto the table right beside her. He begged me to immediately reverse the phantom lien on the 50 acres. He begged me to call off the commercial bankers. He begged me to restore his operational capital before the federal authorities seized his remaining hardware. He pleaded that his entire digital empire, his entire future, and his entire life were completely dependent on my absolute mercy. He promised to sign over any equity I desired. He promised total subservience. He promised anything if I would simply stop the total financial annihilation crashing down upon his shoulders. I did not move. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of comfort to the weeping woman or the frantic young man. I simply opened the heavy leather portfolio resting on the desk in front of me. I withdrew a single crisp white sheet of paper. It bore the heavy, undeniable seal of the county municipal court. I slid the paper slowly across the smooth glass surface until it stopped directly beneath Yvonne's trembling hands. The document was a formalized, legally binding 24-hour eviction notice. The address printed in bold black ink was the exact location of the luxury penthouse she had so aggressively claimed during our settlement. I watched her tear-filled eyes scan the dense legal text. I watched her completely fail to comprehend the total, absolute magnitude of her displacement. I spoke with a voice devoid of anger, devoid of pity, and devoid of any lingering affection. I informed her that the quitclaim deed she had so triumphantly executed was entirely worthless. I informed her that the penthouse had never belonged to Nolan. I informed her that the penthouse, the building it sat atop, and the ground beneath it belonged entirely legally and exclusively to me. I watched the final shred of her sanity fracture as the words finally penetrated her panic. I leaned forward, ensuring every single syllable struck her with the force of a physical blow. I told her the eviction was already in active progress. I told her that my private security team was currently inside the penthouse. I told her they were systematically emptying the closets. I told her they were packing her expensive designer dresses. I told her they were placing every single piece of her custom furniture directly onto the wet city sidewalk. The home she thought she had stolen was gone. The sanctuary she thought she had secured was gone. The life she thought she had violently taken from me was entirely gone. She would not return to a luxury suite overlooking the financial district. She would return to a locked door, a deactivated keycard, and her scattered belongings guarded by men who reported only to me. She was utterly, completely, and permanently homeless. I slowly turned my cold gaze away from Yvonne's broken, sobbing figure. I locked eyes with Wyatt. His manic pleading instantly died in his throat. He saw the absolute, uncompromising finality in my expression. I informed the young man that the toxic debt attached to the 50 acres of rural dirt was entirely legitimate and legally binding. I stated that the commercial bank had acted perfectly within their strict contractual covenants by executing the emergency retrieval rights. I explicitly denied his frantic request for a financial pardon. I told him there would be no corporate bailout. I told him there would be no sudden reversal of fortune. I told him there would be no second chances for a man who had attempted to leverage stolen assets. I told him he would stand before a federal bankruptcy judge exactly at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I told him he would stand there with absolutely zero assets, zero leverage, and zero hope of recovery. His entire existence as a technology CEO was permanently erased. Tamara finally broke her frozen, horrified silence. She pushed past Wyatt, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She screamed that I was a monster. She screamed that I was a cruel, vindictive sociopath intent on destroying my own blood. She screamed that I had deliberately orchestrated this absolute slaughter out of petty, pathetic spite. Her voice cracked, echoing harshly against the mahogany walls, a desperate, shrieking protest against the absolute ruin that had just consumed her entire world. She pointed her finger like a weapon, screaming that I had no soul. I did not raise my voice to counter her hysterical screaming. I simply stood up from the heavy leather chairman's chair. I methodically adjusted my cuffs. I buttoned the front of my tailored charcoal jacket, smoothing the pristine fabric with absolute clinical precision. I looked down at the three shattered individuals trembling before the glass table. I am not a monster. My voice cut sharply through the heavy, suffocating air of the boardroom, vibrating with absolute, undeniable truth. I simply adjusted the reality to match the exact choices you made. You chose betrayal. You chose greed. You chose this exact destination. I raised my right hand. I signaled the two armed corporate security guards standing rigidly by the heavy oak doors. I ordered them to immediately remove the unauthorized trespassers from the executive floor. I ordered them to escort the trio directly down to the street. The guards moved forward instantly, their heavy boots striking the floor with lethal intent, ready to drag the ruined remnants of my former family out of my sight forever. The expansive white marble lobby of the corporate headquarters was no longer an intimidating empty cavern. It was packed shoulder to shoulder with over 500 men and women. These were the line operators, the floor managers, the shipping coordinators, and the heavy machinery mechanics who physically built the company's wealth. They wore scuffed steel-toed boots, heavy denim, and high-visibility jackets. Their presence was a stark, jarring contrast to the sterile, polished aesthetic of the financial district. They had abandoned the manufacturing floors and gathered at the base of the grand staircase in a state of absolute, suffocating dread. The toxic rumors of Nolan's aggressive merger had bled down through the corporate hierarchy over the past 48 hours. Every single worker in that crowded lobby knew exactly what a hostile acquisition meant for their immediate livelihoods. It meant sudden sweeping layoffs. It meant the systematic liquidation of their hard-earned pensions. It meant their highly specialized jobs would be ruthlessly outsourced to cheap overseas contractors before the end of the fiscal quarter. The air was thick with palpable tension and panicked whispers. Men gripped their battered hard hats, silently calculating how they would pay their impending mortgages. Women checked their phones frantically, messaging their spouses about the imminent loss of their family health insurance. They stared up at the gold-plated executive elevators, waiting for the devastating official announcement to echo through the public address system. They fully expected Nolan to descend from his 50th floor fortress and coldly terminate their careers to satisfy his unseen shareholders. The entire workforce stood paralyzed, bracing for absolute financial ruin. They had dedicated decades of loyal labor to the assembly lines, only to be treated as disposable figures on a corporate spreadsheet. The low hum of their collective anxiety vibrated against the marble pillars. The distinct, heavy chime of the private executive elevator sliced sharply through the low hum of panicked voices. The polished brass doors slid open, completely shattering the tense atmosphere of the lobby. The workers instinctively took a collective step back, fully expecting to see Nolan holding his finalized termination manifest. Instead, they witnessed a spectacle of absolute, unfiltered corporate disgrace. Two massive, heavily armed corporate security guards marched forcefully out of the elevator. They were physically escorting Yvonne, Tamara, and Wyatt. The trio did not look like the elite, untouchable socialites who had confidently strutted into the building just an hour earlier. They looked entirely broken. Yvonne was stumbling in her designer heels, her expensive mascara running in dark, humiliating streaks down her pale face. Her hands trembled violently as she clutched her ruined silk blouse. Tamara was hyperventilating tightly, gripping her mother's arm. She buried her face against Yvonne's shoulder in a desperate, futile attempt to hide from the hundreds of staring eyes. Wyatt walked with his head hung low, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, his fraudulent tech empire dreams permanently crushed. The sea of 500 factory workers immediately parted. They formed a wide, silent aisle directly through the center of the pristine marble lobby. The guards marched the disgraced trio straight down this unforgiving gauntlet of working-class men and women. The workers did not say a single word. They simply watched the architects of their near destruction being paraded in complete public humiliation. Yvonne tried to raise her chin, attempting a final pathetic display of superiority, but her legs buckled slightly under the intense, silent scrutiny of the massive crowd. The guards did not slow their rigid pace. They marched them directly to the front entrance. They shoved Yvonne, Tamara, and Wyatt through the heavy glass revolving doors. The security chief immediately deactivated their access chips remotely. The glass doors locked behind them with a loud, final mechanical clank. The trio stumbled out onto the damp, freezing concrete of the financial district. The biting morning wind whipped mercilessly against their expensive, useless clothing. They were completely stripped of their VIP privileges, their stolen assets, and their fabricated dignity, left shivering on the street like common, unwanted trespassers. The heavy oak doors at the top of the grand marble staircase swung open. I stepped out onto the landing, looking down at the massive, silent crowd of men and women who formed the true backbone of the corporation. I walked slowly down the sweeping staircase, the sharp click of my leather shoes echoing clearly in the vast space. I did not carry a termination manifest. I carried the absolute authority of the primary shareholder. I reached the bottom step and walked directly to the main security desk. I picked up the heavy red emergency megaphone resting on the polished stone counter. I pressed the activation trigger. A sharp burst of static cut through the silence. I raised the megaphone and addressed the 500 workers standing before me. I looked directly into their exhausted, fearful faces. I announced with absolute unwavering clarity that the hostile corporate merger was officially and permanently dead. I stated that Nolan had been terminated with extreme prejudice and was currently sitting in federal custody. I watched the profound wave of shock ripple rapidly through the dense crowd. I immediately followed the revelation with a concrete, ironclad guarantee. I explicitly promised that not a single factory worker, mechanic, or shipping coordinator would lose their job today, tomorrow, or at any point in the foreseeable future. The suffocating dread in the room instantly began to evaporate. I did not stop there. I announced the immediate implementation of a sweeping structural reform. I declared that effective immediately, a new mandatory 10% profit-sharing program was actively instituted for all blue-collar employees across every manufacturing division. The staggering wealth generated by their relentless physical labor would no longer exclusively line the pockets of corrupt parasitic executives. A single second of stunned silence hung in the heavy air as the workers fully processed the magnitude of the announcement. Then the entire lobby completely erupted. 500 men and women unleashed a deafening, thunderous roar of absolute victory. Hard hats were thrown high into the vaulted ceiling. Workers embraced each other, shouting and weeping with profound, life-altering relief. The sheer volume of their cheering physically shook the reinforced glass windows of the corporate headquarters. I lowered the megaphone, watching the undeniable joy of a workforce that had just been handed back their futures. Deep inside the tailored pocket of my charcoal suit, my encrypted smartphone began to vibrate with a persistent, desperate rhythm. I pulled the device out and glanced at the illuminated screen. The caller ID displayed the primary office number of Yvonne's highly aggressive divorce attorney. The arrogant man who had mercilessly mocked me in court just 24 hours ago was now calling in a state of absolute frantic panic. He sent a rapid succession of text messages explicitly begging to know if they could voluntarily return the stolen marital assets and forfeit the fraudulent settlement in exchange for a meager, heavily restricted monthly living allowance. The sharp morning wind whipped across the expansive concrete plaza of the county courthouse. It was exactly 48 hours since the federal raid on the corporate tower. I stood perfectly still beside the massive granite pillars, checking my silver wristwatch. I had granted her attorney's desperate, groveling request for a strict 5-minute meeting. I granted the meeting not out of lingering pity, but out of a cold, calculated desire to witness the absolute finality of her ruin. I wanted to see the exact shape of her defeat. I wanted to see the physical manifestation of her greed collapsing. I wanted to witness the absolute end of her arrogance. A battered yellow city taxi pulled up to the curb, its brakes squealing against the gray pavement. Yvonne stepped out. She did not look like the triumphant woman in the tailored crimson dress who had laughed at my expense just days prior. She wore an ill-fitting, faded beige trench coat. She wore shapeless, heavily wrinkled slacks. She wore the undeniable physical proof of her immediate financial ruin. Her hair, usually sprayed into a flawless, immaculate helmet, hung flat and lifeless around her hollow face. She walked up the wide stone steps with a heavy, dragging gait. She looked entirely destroyed. She looked entirely hollow. She looked entirely pathetic. She stopped 3 feet from me, her shoulders hunched against the biting cold. She looked up with wide, bloodshot eyes brimming with desperate, manufactured tears. She called me her sweet Jamie. She called me her gentle rock. She used the exact same saccharine nicknames she had used 40 years ago when we lived in a cramped, drafty apartment on the edge of the city. She used the words that once meant everything to me. She used the words that now meant absolutely nothing. She reached out with a trembling hand, attempting to grasp my tailored sleeve. I stepped back, severing the physical connection before it could even materialize. Yvonne let her empty hand fall to her side, her chest heaving with ragged, uncontrolled sobs. She began to speak in a rapid, frantic torrent of desperate concessions. She offered to immediately return the luxury vehicles she had aggressively seized during the initial settlement. She offered to sign over the massive suburban estate she had claimed as her exclusive property. She offered to completely forfeit every single dollar of the retirement funds she had meticulously drained from our shared accounts. She begged me to take it all back. She begged me to accept the assets as a token of her absolute remorse. She wept openly, the tears carving clean, wet paths through her hasty, uneven makeup. She cried that she had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. She cried that Nolan had manipulated her mind, poisoned her judgment, and blinded her to the profound, unconditional love I had always provided. She cried that she was merely a victim of his towering corporate deception. I looked at her with absolute unwavering indifference. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt absolutely nothing. The woman standing before me was a complete stranger, wearing the borrowed skin of my past. I watched her weep, recognizing the performance for exactly what it was. It was a calculated theatrical display of survival. She was not mourning the death of our 40-year marriage. She was mourning the sudden violent death of her bank accounts. She was mourning the loss of her penthouse. She was mourning the total evaporation of her elite social standing. I listened to her hollow apologies without shifting my posture. I listened to her desperate bargaining without blinking. The utter disgust I held for her was entirely silent, but it radiated through the freezing air between us. She had ruthlessly orchestrated my financial execution alongside a corporate predator, and now that the predator was caged, she expected me to willingly resume the role of her faithful, silent provider. She expected me to fund her redemption. She expected me to catch her as she plummeted from the pedestal she had built on my back. I stared into her frantic, weeping eyes, allowing the freezing silence to stretch. I allowed the heavy, suffocating weight of my total detachment to completely crush her remaining hope. I reached slowly into the interior pocket of my heavy charcoal coat. I withdrew a single folded document. It was the original court-stamped divorce decree she had so triumphantly snatched from her lawyer's hands in courtroom 4B. The heavy parchment detailed every single asset she had ruthlessly taken, every account she had drained, and every legal tether she had completely severed. I placed the document flat onto the cold surface of the concrete bench beside us. I pushed it slowly across the rough stone. The thick paper stopped directly in front of her trembling hands. Yvonne stared down at the decree, her breath catching in her throat as the absolute finality of the paper set in. She looked up at me, her eyes begging for a reprieve that would never come. I broke the silence with a voice devoid of any human warmth. I told her that she had plotted in the shadows for those specific items. I told her that she had aggressively demanded those specific items. I told her that she had humiliated me in public to secure those specific items. I told her to keep them. I stated clearly and irrevocably that they belonged to her now, just as the devastating consequences of her actions belonged entirely to her. I leaned forward, ensuring my final words struck her with absolute paralyzing force. I do not buy back trash. The words hung in the freezing air, striking her with the impact of a physical blow. She recoiled violently, stumbling backward down the first stone step. The decree fluttered slightly in the wind, remaining pinned to the concrete bench. I had given her exactly what she fought for. I had given her the assets. I had given her the legal separation. I had given her the absolute ruin she had ultimately chosen. I turned my back on her weeping, broken figure. I did not look over my shoulder as I walked deliberately down the wide granite stairs of the plaza. My polished leather shoes struck the pavement with a steady, rhythmic, unstoppable cadence. The heavy black Maybach waited silently at the curb, its engine humming with quiet, contained power. I approached the rear door, reaching into my pocket to retrieve my smartphone. The illuminated screen displayed a rapid, frantic cascade of notifications. There were exactly 20 missed calls. Every single call was from Tamara. My daughter was desperately attempting to bridge the massive burning chasm she had actively helped create. She was calling to beg for salvation. She was calling to secure a financial lifeline. I stared at her glowing name on the digital display. I felt the familiar rhythmic pulse of the phone vibrating against my palm. I pressed a single definitive button. I permanently blocked her number. I wiped her contact profile from the system. I completely and utterly erased their existence from my digital life forever. I slid into the luxurious leather interior of the waiting vehicle, closing the heavy door on the past. The sunlight breaks cleanly across the polished mahogany desk, casting long, sharp shadows across the 50th floor chairman's suite. It is a quiet Monday morning. The chaotic, deafening roar of the previous week has entirely evaporated, replaced by a profound, impenetrable silence. The heavy double doors remain firmly closed. There is no frantic knocking. There is no shrill, demanding voice echoing down the corridor. There is absolutely no manipulation, no calculated deceit, and no lingering disrespect poisoning the air. I sit perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair, the seat of absolute authority I reclaimed from the ashes of Nolan's spectacular ruin. The vast office is stripped of the gaudy, ostentatious artwork Yvonne had previously commissioned to mark her anticipated territory. The walls are bare, clean, and functional. I trace my fingertips along the smooth edge of the desk, feeling the solid, unyielding reality of my victory. The parasitic elements that had attached themselves to my life are gone. Yvonne is navigating the harsh, unforgiving realities of the city streets without a single dollar of my capital. Wyatt is standing before a federal bankruptcy judge, facing the total liquidation of his fraudulent technological empire. Tamara is entirely blocked from my existence, her desperate pleas bouncing off a permanently deactivated number. They chose their path of greed, and the resulting silence in this room is the direct physical manifestation of my refusal to fund their treachery any longer. The air I breathe is finally my own. The space I occupy is entirely secure. The fortress is sealed. I do not feel a shred of guilt for the absolute devastation I unleashed upon them. They viewed my patience as an exploitable weakness. They interpreted my silent observation as senility. They orchestrated my financial execution with terrifying precision, entirely confident that I would simply fade into the background. I proved them fatally wrong. The quietness of this morning is not a void. It is a monument to my resilience. I rise from the leather chair and walk with measured, deliberate steps toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The city skyline stretches out before me in a sprawling network of steel, glass, and concrete. The morning traffic moves in a steady, distant rhythm far below, entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in power that occurred within these walls. I press my palm against the cool, thick glass. I look down at the financial district, remembering the exact moment I realized my family viewed my death as a lucrative business opportunity. The journey from that suffocating realization to this pinnacle of absolute control was brutal. It required the surgical amputation of 40 years of emotional history. It demanded a ruthlessness I did not know I possessed until survival made it entirely necessary. I am no longer the tired, discarded man they planned to quietly lock away in a sterile care facility. I am no longer the silent bank account they intended to systematically drain. The narrative they wrote for me ended in quiet obscurity and financial ruin. I took their script, tore it to shreds, and wrote an entirely different ending. I am the sole architect of my own destiny. Every building in this skyline represents a different empire, a different hierarchy of power. My empire remains intact because I chose to fight with intellect rather than raw emotion. I weaponized their blinding arrogance against them. I allowed their unchecked greed to dig the exact pit they eventually fell into. The reflection staring back at me in the heavy glass is not a victim. The face I see is etched with the hard lines of experience, the calm certainty of a man who looked betrayal in the eye and absolutely crushed it. I built this corporate machine with my bare hands decades ago. I built it through relentless labor, sharp intuition, and unwavering discipline. It was never a playground for incompetent socialites or fraudulent tech entrepreneurs. It is an engine of industry. And my hands are back on the controls. The city outside operates on ruthless logic, and I have proven that my logic is undeniably superior. The chill of the glass against my skin grounds me in the present moment. I survived their calculated ambush. I survived the agonizing sting of Yvonne's betrayal. I survived the sickening realization that my own daughter viewed me merely as a stepping stone to an unearned fortune. I stand at the very top of the city looking down on the streets where they now must learn to survive. My vision is clear. My focus is absolute. A sharp, respectful knock on the heavy mahogany doors breaks my concentration. I turn away from the panoramic view of the skyline as the doors open smoothly. The chief financial officer enters the room. He does not carry the arrogant, entitled swagger that Nolan's inner circle displayed just days ago. He moves with professional efficiency, his expression focused and respectful. He crosses the vast expanse of the office and stops directly in front of the desk. He places a thick, pristine stack of legal documents onto the leather blotting pad. The pages are immaculate, devoid of the toxic financial leverage and parasitic clauses that defined the previous administration. The CFO looks at me, offering a brief professional nod. He informs me that these are the finalized structural frameworks I requested immediately following the termination of the hostile merger. The documents detail the exact legal architecture for the new employee healthcare initiative and the internal housing charity fund. The capital that Yvonne and Nolan had planned to siphon into offshore accounts is now permanently redirected back into the foundation of the company. It will provide comprehensive medical coverage for the 500 men and women working on the factory floors. It will offer aggressive interest-free housing loans to the laborers who physically construct our wealth. The money will no longer fuel the vanity of the elite. It will fortify the lives of the working class. The CFO steps back, waiting for my final authorization. He understands the profound shift in the corporate culture. The era of unchecked executive embezzlement is entirely over. The era of genuine sustainable stability has officially begun. I step back to the desk, looking down at the crisp white pages representing a vastly improved future. I reach for the heavy silver pen resting perfectly aligned beside the leather portfolio. My grip is firm. My hand is completely steady. I press the nib against the thick parchment and sign my name across the bottom line of the primary authorization document. The ink flows smoothly, permanently locking the capital into the employee trust fund. I sign the second page. I sign the third. Every signature is a definitive strike against the greed that nearly destroyed this company. I close the portfolio and slide it back across the desk toward the waiting executive. He nods, taking the documents before quietly exiting the office. The heavy doors latch shut, returning the room to its pristine silence. I reach out and pick up the porcelain cup of hot black coffee waiting on my desk. The heat radiates comfortably into my palm. I raise the cup to my lips and take a slow, deliberate sip. The dark, bitter liquid grounds me perfectly in the moment. I look back toward the towering windows and the sprawling city beyond. A genuine, unburdened smile finally breaks across my face. The silent adjustment is completely finished. The toxic elements are entirely purged. The correct order is fully and permanently restored. True power is never found in loud declarations or aggressive manipulation. It resides in the quiet, unyielding capacity to observe, analyze, and act with absolute precision. Unchecked greed blinds individuals to the severe consequences of their own actions, making them foolishly underestimate the silent resilience of those they betray. When you build a life on a fragile foundation of deceit, the inevitable collapse is completely devastating. Justice does not always require anger or vengeance. Often, true justice is simply allowing the undeniable truth to surface and letting toxic people dismantle their own lives. Protect your boundaries and sever poisonous ties. Did you enjoy this story of silent justice and reclaimed power? If this narrative resonated with you, please leave a comment below, sharing your favorite moment. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible life story.